Chapter 1589. This horrifying scene caused all the living beings in the surroundings to feel distressed, and all of them revealed an indescribable sense of fear. It wasn't that these creatures lacked willpower, but the scene was just too shocking and unbelievable to them. It must be said that each of these creatures had at least hundreds of millions of years to grow. Moreover, they were able to join their respective organizations, which meant that they were already standing at the peak of their respective regions. Only then could they attract the attention of their organizations. With such a background, they had always thought that they stood at the peak of this world. There might be creatures in this world that could defeat them, and there might be powers that could harm them, but there should be very few powers that could exceed the limits of their understanding. However, at this moment, a power that completely exceeded the limits of their understanding had descended and directly wiped out existences that were similar to them. This situation suddenly made them recall how they felt when they were still weak. How could they not be shocked and fearful? The goat-like creature watched the creature die and couldn't help but sigh. I didn't expect it to actually be true. You actually avoided being punished by the heavens for harming those creatures. Evidently, it was only at this moment that the goat-like creature truly believed what Luo Fan had said back then, that his identity was special. As for the creature's warning to not attack, it was merely an instinctive action. In fact, it could be said that the creature's attack was actually beneficial to it. It allowed it to truly confirm what Luo Fan's nature was like. Luo Fan quietly hovered there. His expression was extremely calm. Although there was danger just now, and he almost followed in the footsteps of the tortoise-backed ape, he was in a pretty good mood. At the very least, he had completely confirmed his previous guess. I've already said that. Luo Fan smiled faintly. After fighting in the cage of nothingness for a few years, he and the goat-like creature could be considered familiar. At this moment, they were acting like old friends. The goat seemed a little surprised that Luo Fan actually answered it. It said, "This situation can't last forever, right? Aren't you worried at all with so many experts surrounding this place?" "What's there to worry about? Although there were quite a number of experts. But if I want to leave, who can stop me?" Luo Fan said lightly. Hearing this, the goat's expression changed slightly, even though it was unwilling to admit it. However, it could not deny that what Luo Fan said was the truth. For an existence at Luo Fan's level, for Luo Fan who had grasped so many powers and concepts, if he wanted to escape, there was indeed no powerhouse here that could stop him. You can escape, but what about them? The goat gestured to the civilized country below. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "Even though this matter has passed, they are still protected by the heavens and earth. It's impossible for you to exterminate them. At that time, there would definitely be many accidents. In the end, all your plans will go up in smoke." These words, however, were spoken with confidence, and there was no uncertainty in them at all. Upon hearing this, the goat sneered and made up his mind to destroy the entire civilized nation at the first possible moment. Naturally, it could not believe such an unbelievable thing. At this special moment, the heavens and earth would protect the living beings in the civilized country. However, once this matter passed, it did not believe that the heavens and earth would still protect them like a nanny. Luo Fan naturally knew what it was thinking at a glance. However, he only smiled faintly. At this moment, a creature in the distance asked, "What kind of existence are you?" This creature looked like a round ball with no hands or feet, but its face was rather sinister. At this moment, as it shouted, a powerful aura naturally emitted from its body and pressed down on Luo Fan. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled faintly, but he had no intention of answering. He was conversing with the goat only because he had fought with it in the cage of nothingness for a long time and was already familiar with it. The creature in front of him was completely unfamiliar, and the first impression he got was that it was a rather unpleasant creature. How could he waste time talking nonsense with it? His disregard clearly made the creature extremely unhappy. "Humph! It snorted coldly, its eyes filled with indescribable resentment. This resentment even materialized and rolled around its body like a black fog. However, perhaps because the outcome of the turtleback ape was too tragic, it had already washed away the lesson. At this moment, although its resentment had condensed into a substance and was rolling, it did not dare to make a move. It did not even dare to let its resentment descend and make Luo Fan suffer. However, it could only stare at Luo Fan with its eyes and grit its teeth in its heart. When the other living beings saw this ball-like creature suffer a setback, all of their expressions became rather strange. Some of them seemed to be angry, some of them seemed to be rejoicing, and some of them even seemed to be taking pleasure in its misfortune. At this moment, the war in the civilized country below finally came to an end. On the side of the civilized country established by the creature created by Qing Yi and Yu Ji, the last creature that participated in the war finally could not withstand the opponent's attack. Under the opponent's attack, it completely lost its life and was smashed into pieces by its opponent. Even its life essence collapsed and completely integrated into the world, finally disappearing without a trace. At the same time, on the side of the civilized country established by the creature created by Gui Shou, there were only 11 creatures left who participated in the war. Moreover, among the 11 creatures, only one of them was truly unscathed. The rest were either on their last breaths and could not keep their bodies intact, or they had already fainted and completely lost their combat power. That scene was as embarrassing as one could imagine. However, no matter how bad the scene was, one had a creature that survived while the other did not. Clearly, the outcome had already been decided. At this moment, a series of thunderclaps suddenly rang out in the void. Amidst the thunderclaps, the entire world began to shake violently. Faintly, it looked as if there was an invisible hand grabbing onto the world, causing it to shake violently. Indistinctly, an inexplicable multicolored light seeped out of the void, directly covering the civilized country that spanned billions of miles below. This multicolored light was extremely mysterious and profound. Under this multicolored light, the mysteries of the true sage, the fragments of the great Tao, time, space, and even all other powers and rules. All sorts of inexplicable changes happened to all the laws. Amidst these changes, an indescribable fluctuation completely enveloped the civilized country. And amidst these fluctuations, the vitality in the entire civilized country began to skyrocket. In just a few breaths, the vitality had already grown from a level that was almost non-existent to a level that was 100 times stronger than when the vitality in the civilized country was at its most exuberant. Under this vitality, the murderous aura produced by the war was quickly dispelled. The various plants that had been cleared out during the war were like withered trees that had been given a new lease of life. They began to grow rapidly and flourish rapidly. Indistinctly. In some places, creatures with born Taoism aptitude were even born out of thin air. Although these living beings had never appeared before, traces of the living beings with born Taoism aptitudes who had died in the war could be found on their bodies. It was as if the characteristics of the many dead living beings had been scattered and reassembled. There were many of these creatures, and they were of all ages when they were born. They did not look like normal people at all, as they were just babies when they were born. Due to these changes, the number of creatures in the civilized country that spanned billions of miles began to rapidly approach the state before the war. Of course, the nature of these creatures born in the civilized country was the same as the creatures with born Taoism aptitude that Gui Shou had created. Vaguely, they were slightly different from the creatures that Qing Yi and Yu Ji had created. This situation clearly meant that the creatures created by Gui Shou had become the protagonists of this world. With such changes happening in the civilized country, the changes happening at the foot of the mountain where the battlefield was located weren't any smaller than the changes happening in the civilized country. On the contrary, the changes happening there were even greater, more obvious, and more eye-catching than the changes happening in the entire civilized country. This was because, at this moment, under the shroud of the multicolored light, the 11 creatures with born Taoism aptitude who had survived the war were like sponges that were soaked in water. They began to frantically devour the endless mysteries of the true sage around them, as well as the infinite multicolored light that descended from above the void. In this process of continuous devouring, the 11 of them, regardless of whether they were injured or not, completely recovered to their peak state in an instant. All the negative conditions that had originally appeared on their bodies had completely disappeared in an instant, as if they had never appeared before. As for their cultivation realm, it started to rise crazily in that instant, jumping crazily. It could almost be said that in an instant, their cultivation realm had already broken through the barrier between level 9 and false sage, directly stepping into the false sage level. From an existence that was originally at the level of an ant in front of a false sage, they had become a false sage. Each of them exuded a supreme, eternal, indestructible, omniscient, and omnipotent aura. Under this aura, the 11 of them gradually emitted an indescribable aura. It was as if they had comprehended and seen through everything. It was as if they had grasped and controlled everything. Ever since this aura appeared, it seemed as if there was no limit to it. It began to grow endlessly and expand endlessly. From the surroundings of the mountain, to 1/10 of the civilized country, to 1/5, and to the entire civilized country. Outside the civilized country, it was unknown how many billions of miles away it was. With such a vast area and so many living beings surrounding it, they were naturally enveloped by this aura. Even Luo Fan was no exception. Luo Fan had a special identity, so he did not feel much about this aura at all. However, the other living beings were not so lucky. At this moment, they felt that this aura seemed to have directly drilled into their hearts and pressed down on their souls. It brought them incredible pressure, making them feel a negative feeling that normally, this aura would not bring them. What's going on? At this moment, all the living beings had similar thoughts in their mind. They were confident. Their strength was enough to easily crush this living being that emitted such an aura. Originally, this aura should not have been much to them. However, at this moment, this aura actually had such a penetrating ability. It could actually directly penetrate into the depths of their hearts and directly target their life source, their life essence. It felt as if they had met their natural enemy. That feeling. It was obvious how shocking it was to them. So that's how it is. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind at this moment, and he could not help but reveal a faint smile on his face. Originally, he had thought that the living beings in this civilized country would not be able to escape this time and would definitely be completely annihilated by these living beings. However, from the looks of it now, there was still a chance for things to turn around. The living beings in this civilized country might really be able to survive safely. The reason was very simple. Because, in the civilized country, the 11 living beings who had survived the war. At this moment, they had already become false saints. They were the first batch of false saints that had appeared in this world. In addition, they were the true protagonists of this world, the false saints. Therefore, these false saints had extraordinary power, causing them to have an effect on all living beings born in this world. In other words, they had essentially become the natural enemy of all living beings born in this world. This way, as long as their strength was not too far apart, they would have an absolutely crushing effect when facing these living beings. They would be able to easily deal with them through some inexplicable changes. If that was all, it would at most show that these false saints were extraordinarily powerful and that they could walk relatively safely in this world. It was still not enough to protect the entire civilized country under such circumstances. In fact, the most fundamental reason that made Luo Fan make this judgment was that these false saints were omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient in the space-time within the range of their auras. Within this range, other than existences like Luo Fan and Gui Shou, who were almost their creators, No other living beings could harm them, let alone kill them. In other words, the range covered by the auras of these false saints was equivalent to the world where other false saints had achieved Tao and become false saints. To these false saints, it was almost a one-to-one relationship. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan had such a realization at this moment. He clearly knew that these living beings were enough to protect the entire civilized country under the attacks of so many living beings. The improvement of the 11 false saints did not stop there. While Luo Fan was secretly lamenting and the other living beings were secretly terrified, the false saints were still continuously improving. Their bodies seemed to have turned into black holes as the endless mysteries of the true saint realm, the fragments of the great path, and all other powers and nomological laws surged into their bodies, constantly pushing their aura to grow stronger, pushing their cultivation realm to a higher level. At this moment, they did not think as much as the other living beings. To them, they only felt as if they had come into contact with the deepest and most fundamental truth in the world. At every moment, they could feel their life essence sublimating, their Tao realm increasing, and they could easily crush themselves like ants a moment ago. At this moment, they all saw the many creatures around this civilized country. They saw Luo Fan, and they also saw the existence above. Gui Shou, Qing Yi, and Yu Ji also saw the many living beings on the mountain peak who had been enlightened by Luo Fan and gained intelligence for a moment. Countless pieces of information appeared out of thin air. All kinds of information that were originally outside of their perception but were closely related to them appeared in their memories, allowing them to know and understand everything in the blink of an eye. So, we're already the protagonists of this world. A feeling of sorrow and joy filled the hearts of the 11 false saints. This caused their expressions to become somewhat complicated. Their sorrow was very simple. It was for the position of the protagonists of this world, who knew how many trillions of their compatriots had died. Among these people, there were even some who were originally ranked in the millions or tens of millions of their races. But now, for the position of the protagonists of this world, they were the only ones left. How could they not be sad about this kind of sacrifice? Their joy was self-evident. From an ordinary race in this world, they had directly grown to become the true protagonists of this world. They had become a race that was loved by this world. This was, of course, something worthy of joy. At this moment, Gui Shou, who was in the void, also changed. At this moment, Gui Shou felt that his mind could not stop rushing into that unknown place. Moreover, there was a pulling force that pulled his mind towards an indescribable place, a place that he had never been able to reach before. Endless mysteries of the true saint. They kept flashing in his heart and lingering. At the same time, an indescribable power descended on his body out of thin air. This kind of power kept squirming and changing, finally constructing a cage of nothingness that enveloped his body. After this cage of nothingness appeared, it did not stop changing. It didn't stop there. Instead, it was as if an unimaginable existence was constantly adjusting it. His entire state was undergoing some kind of indescribable change at every moment. The nothingness inside was also changing, gradually approaching that concept. This was obviously a kind of qualitative improvement. In the past, although Gui Shou was stronger than ordinary creatures with inborn wisdom, the cage of nothingness that he constructed with the help of his power was filled with nothingness that could transform everything. It was still extremely far away from the true concept of nothingness. But now, he didn't need to cultivate at all. All he had to do was simply accept the benefits of the creatures he created becoming the protagonists of this world, and he had actually transcended that distance. He had directly turned the power into a cage of nothingness, turning it into a cage of nothingness. Seeing this, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat, and his mind sank into that unknown place. At this moment, he found that there was also an inexplicable suction that was pulling his mind towards that unknown place. This allowed his mind to break through the originally extremely deep depth and arrive at another place that was even deeper. Of course, perhaps it was because the depth that he could reach was already extremely deep, or perhaps it was because he was separated from the living beings created by the longevity turtle, after all, and didn't benefit much from it. Therefore, this suction force didn't move his mind too much. However, it only allowed his mind to go a little deeper before it became weak and could no longer move forward. Compared to the improvement obtained by the turtle lifespan, this was really insignificant. Compared to the few false saints that had just become false saints, it was indescribably small. However, even so, he was already quite satisfied with it. After all, this was an unexpected gain. Moreover, the extent of the improvement was nothing compared to Gui's show and those false saints. However, he had a high realm and powerful strength after all. From an absolute point of view, this kind of improvement was already extremely considerable. In fact, it could be said that he had obtained much more benefits than Gui's show and the others. What was there to be dissatisfied with such a gain? Looking at the changes on Gui's show's body, Qin Yi and Yu Ji, who were not far away from Gui's show, were both envious and helpless. Chapter 1590. This change lasted for several days before it stopped. Novel. When all the changes subsided, the civilized country had completely changed. The inexplicable estrangement between it and the outside world had been completely smoothed out. Moreover, the endless buildings that originally existed in the entire civilized country seemed to have been endowed with inexplicable mysteries. Even the most ordinary things had almost become magic tools and magic treasures. Any bit of it would almost be a family treasure in the hands of mortals. If they knew how to use it, they could even exert extraordinary terrifying power. Of course, this was only in the hands of mortals in other worlds. In this world that was filled with endless mysteries of the true divine realm, there were countless fragments of the great Tao that contained unbelievable power, and the space-time was also so high-end. However, these only allowed them to exist for a long time without any protection in this world. As for any other inconceivable abilities, there was none. The buildings had undergone such changes, and the creatures that were born in them had also inexplicably changed from before. In contrast, their connection with this world seemed to have completely changed. In the past, no matter what these creatures were like, they had an inexplicable estrangement with this world. If they wanted to survive in this world, they needed to be cautious and vigilant of any changes in the surrounding environment. But now, the situation was completely different. Now they had become incomparably harmonious with this world. All the environmental changes in this world were no longer a threat to them. It felt like the original astral wind tornado had directly become a kind of gentle breeze. In other words, after such a change, the creatures in this civilized country could already do countless things that they could not do in the past. They could also easily do countless things that required countless preparations in the past. These various changes were almost like ordinary people returning to Earth from living on Mars. The creatures in this civilized country had such changes. In the void above, the changes on Gui's show's body were not small. At this moment, the cage of nothingness that had shrouded his body had already disappeared. His whole body was floating there. In his eyes, there was an extremely deep wisdom that could not be seen in the past. With this kind of wisdom, he no longer looked like a living creature that had only improved after being guided by Luo Fan. It was more like the one standing opposite Luo Fan. Those were the higher-ups of various organizations. At least, the wisdom in his eyes seemed to be the case. At this moment, the multicolored lights that descended from the void had completely disappeared. This world, this civilized country, and the space-time within billions of kilometers around this civilized country had completely returned to normal. Of course, this was only what it looked like on the surface. In fact, the boundless space-time had undergone a tremendous change. Vaguely, the entire space-time had an additional layer between that ineffable place and the normal space-time. There was an additional layer of strange existences with 11 main bodies as the core. This layer of strange existence made it so that any living being who wanted to contact that mysterious place and guide that mysterious power from that mysterious place would have to pass through that strange existence. In other words, they had to obtain the consent of the 11 cores. As long as these 11 cores did not agree, normally speaking, no living being, no matter how powerful, would be able to contact that mysterious place, and the inexplicable place in your strange existence is none other than the 11 living beings in this civilized country who obtained an increase in their intrinsic quality due to the favor of the world after the war ended. They were originally at the pseudo-saint level, but they have advanced from the pseudo-saint level to the pseudo-saint level. Now, they were the 11 pseudo-sages who had become sages with the mysteries of the true sage. These 11 pseudo-sages were not in this normal spacetime at this moment. Instead, they were directly in the 11 cores, sitting there cross-legged. They seemed to be cultivating, but they also seemed to be in a deep sleep. However, they had no intention of meeting Luo Fan or Guo Shou. It was not that they had any disrespectful thoughts towards Luo Fan or Guo Shou, but that they did not have the time to do so. That was because at this moment, they were facing countless living beings that could destroy the entire civilized country with a sneeze. Moreover, these living beings were all eyeing the civilized country covetously. They wanted to completely destroy the entire civilized country at any time and kill them all. At such a moment, they did not dare to relax at all. At this moment, they were trying their best to seal the connection between all living beings and that mysterious place. If they had a few years to cultivate and study it properly, they might be able to complete this seal easily. They did not need to directly sink into that strange existence and use their own strength to increase the effect of this seal. However, that would be many years later. At this time, they had just become pseudo-sages, so their control over their own mystical abilities was rather ordinary. Under this kind of control, if they wanted to complete this blockade, they could only use all of their efforts and put everything they had into it. Only in this way could they have the confidence to protect the entire civilized country and all the living beings in it. When this seal appeared, the many living beings opposite Luo Fan all felt it. What's going on? At this moment, their eyes were filled with disbelief. When all the phenomena in the void calmed down, all of them were already prepared to launch an attack on this civilized country and Luo Fan. However, when they wanted to take action, they suddenly felt that their abilities had suddenly lost their effectiveness. Vaguely, there seemed to be a powerful suppression acting on their abilities. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't break through this suppression. They couldn't use their abilities that had already reached the acme of perfection or even sublimated to the point of being able to display their abilities. To them, this inconceivable change was like pulling out the spine of an ordinary person. It was so terrifying that an ordinary person could not even stand up. At this moment, all the mere people were panicking. They kept observing each other, observing Luo Fan, and observing the Wenmian country. They wanted to see what was going on. They wanted to see why this would suddenly happen. When they saw everything clearly, they were shocked. All of them. The living beings who fought against this civilized country and Luo Fan were all in trouble. Instead, it was Luo Fan. It seemed like there was no change at all. He was still so confident and in control of everything. With their intelligence, how could they not understand this situation? This was clearly the other party's method to deal with them. How could they not panic when they understood this? How could they not be shocked? Let's go. At this moment, they made a prompt decision and completely abandoned the determination they had previously made to completely destroy the entire civilized country. They turned around and fled into the distance. However, how could Luo Fan let them escape? One had to know that all of these living beings were existences that surpassed the despair realm. One could imagine the danger of such an existence. If not for the suppression of this civilized country, even Luo Fan would be in danger if he encountered them. At this time, there was finally an environment that could completely suppress their strength. How could Luo Fan let them go so easily? With this thought in mind, Luo Fan said calmly, "Everyone, you should stay." As he spoke, his heart stirred. An inexplicable power was guided from that inexplicable place. It directly passed through the strange existence created by the 11 fake saints and easily descended into this normal spacetime. The creation template of the living beings in this civilized country came from Luo Fan. It could be said that Luo Fan was also the creator of this world. He was just separated by a layer. With such an identity, although he could not have deep control over all the living beings in this civilized country like he Goeisho, it was still easy for him to not be affected by all the forces in this civilized country. Therefore, although that strange existence could restrict the goat, the 9-headed and 13-armed living beings, and other living beings that could turn that inexplicable power into various concepts, it did not affect him at all. He could still guide that inexplicable power down and easily suppress the many other living beings that could actually pose a great threat to him if they joined forces. The inexplicable power was directed at the hundreds of powerful living beings, and each of them had to deal with a part of that power. This method of dividing power was much more proficient and powerful than before. At this time, it could be said that he could almost control it as he pleased. When targeting each living being, the power didn't directly transform into various concepts like before. Instead, the power itself directly acted on those living beings. If these living beings could summon power and perfectly exert their strength in the past, Luo Fan's method would definitely not work. Any one of them could easily destroy this power with a deeper change in power. However, at this time, the ability of these living beings to summon power had been completely suppressed. Facing this power, they could only rely on everything in their bodies to deal with it. At this time, apart from a few living beings that had gathered the power into their bodies and were ready to attack at any time, most of the living beings could only rely on the mysteries of the true divine realm, the great Tao fragments, and other mysterious powers to deal with it. As such, in the blink of an eye, almost 90% of the living beings had their resistance easily crushed by the power and were directly subdued. The remaining 10% or so of living beings were those that could absorb the power that was guided down into their own bodies. For these living beings, although they could not guide the inexplicable power down, they could release the inexplicable power that existed in their bodies. Although it was water without a source, it was a tree without roots, but at least it had a resistance that was thousands of times stronger than other living beings. At this moment, when they faced the power that Luo Fan guided down, their expressions changed drastically. Their expressions changed greatly, and without hesitation, they released all the power they could muster. At this time, they wanted to leave as soon as possible. How could they show any mercy? They directly transformed the remaining power that they could use into various concepts and blasted it towards the power that Luo Fan guided down. The reason why Luo Fan directly used the power itself to attack these living beings was to prepare for this moment. At this moment, when he faced the power that had been transformed into various concepts, with a jolt of his heart, the power that was heading towards them naturally changed correspondingly. It also turned into various opposing concepts and directly collided with the concepts that they released. Under such a change, the void shook. All kinds of incredible light and shadows appeared everywhere. The space-time within the entire civilized country began to shake violently. Countless tiny space-time cracks were produced in the midst of the tremors. They spread out densely, almost covering the entire civilized country. At this moment, it was a place that was hidden between an inexplicable place and normal space-time. The 11 false saints did not dare to be negligent. They each released their power and directly controlled the space-time within the range that they could control. They closed the countless fine cracks and completely eliminated the aftershocks produced by the countless battles. In the end, the space-time within this range returned to normal. The entire process was extremely fast. It felt as if the aftershocks of the battle did not cause any abnormalities at all. However, the living beings in the civilized country did not even discover it. Facing such a change, Gui Shou, who was watching from the void, felt relieved. He stopped what he was originally preparing to do and eliminate all kinds of abnormalities. To Gui Shou, the feeling he had towards the living beings in this civilized country was completely different from before. In the past, even if he had some feelings for these living beings, he only felt that they were his creations. That feeling was just like the feelings a child had for his toys. However, now that the living beings in this civilized country had become the true protagonists of this world and brought him huge benefits, he completely treated these living beings as his own children. His importance had already risen to a whole new level. It was also because of this change in feelings that he was so anxious to protect this civilized country and prevent the aftershocks of the battle from destroying it. Luo Fan did not care about the aftershocks of the battle at this moment. Now, this civilized country no longer needed him to protect it as much as before. Now, this civilized country already had its own false saint. All the changes that had negative effects on it would naturally be dealt with by the false saint. At this moment, Luo Fan focused all his attention on the living beings that could still resist. Although only about 10% of the living beings could absorb the power into their own bodies, don't forget that there were hundreds of living beings. Even 10% of them were as many as dozens of them. Even if these dozens of living beings were rootless trees and water without a source, their resistance had reached a considerable level. If he didn't deal with it carefully, they might really escape. Among those living beings, one of them saw the situation clearly and shouted, "Let's work together." To them, although the current Luo Fan's attack strength was not much stronger than theirs, he had an advantage in that his power was endless. If they did not break through Luo Fan's barrier in a short period of time, what awaited them would definitely be the fate of being restrained like the other living beings. The other living beings were obviously intelligent. Although they did not think of it before, they naturally understood after being reminded by this living being. They all agreed and began to quickly gather in the center. Seeing this, Luo Fan could not help but frown. He did not expect things to develop to this point. These living beings were not weak. Even at this moment when they were suppressed, they were not considered weak. The only difference between them and their normal state was their ability to continue fighting. In this case, they gathered and worked together to fight against Luo Fan. That was obviously to play to their strengths and avoid their weaknesses. They maximized their advantage of not being affected in combat and avoided their disadvantage of being weaker in continuous fighting as much as possible. But this is nothing. An indescribable fighting spirit surged in Luo Fan's heart. Although this brought him great pressure, at the same time, it could also let him truly witness the true strength of these living beings before him. He wanted to see what these living beings could show him that could enlighten him. At this moment, with a single thought, an endless amount of power descended from a mysterious place and engulfed the many living beings. This power. It was already what he could summon. All the power was something that he could control. All the power that he could control. Under this power, the entire space-time trembled slightly. It was as if even the space-time could not withstand this power. After this power descended, it began to change rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it began to transform into countless concepts. Indistinctly, it formed a mysterious and wonderful world in the void. This world. It was completely different from all the worlds that Luo Fan had seen in the past. It was even to the extent that it was completely different from the world of power he had constructed when he truly saw that mysterious existence in the palace. Everything that formed this world was a concept. Time was a concept, space was a concept, energy was a concept, matter was a concept, rules were a concept, nomological laws were a concept, the Great Path was a concept, and even the mysteries were concepts. These countless concepts had almost exhausted Luo Fan's understanding of concepts, and had almost exhausted his evolution of concepts. They did not merge, and the distance between them was still extremely clear. However, it was such a clear concept that constructed this world so complete and perfect. Worldview. After constructing this world, Luo Fan could not help but sigh in his heart. The more he cultivated, the more he felt the wonders of the worldview. If he had never sorted out and summarized his unique worldview, it would have been possible for him to construct such a world, but it would have taken him a very long time to comprehend and study it. But now, for him, he only needed to change these concepts according to the description of his worldview, and then combine them together to naturally form such a complete world. Similarly, he had also benefited from this worldview when he used the power of laws to construct the world. The various incredible methods of constructing the world in the past were also completed so easily and casually because of the existence of his worldview. This was because Luo Fan's worldview had now been perfected to an unbelievable level. Therefore, the world that he constructed at this moment, which was completely composed of concepts, was even more perfect than the world that Hun Guzi and the others had used all their efforts and relied on so many great paths to open up in the various worlds. If this world continued to exist for a long time, it would not be impossible for it to give birth to a false saint that was closer to becoming a true saint than the false saint that had become a true saint through the mysteries of the true saint. After this world was formed, it naturally produced all kinds of incredible effects. It naturally began to change the dozens of living beings that had gathered together and were surrounded by all kinds of incredible concepts. This was because the world itself was constructed by concepts, and the concepts around the bodies of many living beings were the most basic existences in this world. The terrifying effects of those concepts had completely disappeared in this world. No matter which one it was, it had become the most ordinary thing in this world. It was no longer as troublesome as it was before to separate such a thing. Under Luo Fan's control, the world naturally produced all kinds of changes. Bolts of lightning descended from the void and easily drilled into the gaps between the various concepts between the living beings. Under the bursts of explosions, the living beings naturally scattered and could no longer gather together. With the amount of power that these living beings grasped and the strength of the concepts, they should not have been in such a sorry state. They should have been able to bring more trouble to Luo Fan and make him need more complicated methods to separate them. However, they could do nothing about it. The world formed by this concept was a completely foreign existence to them. They did not know how to defend themselves or how to resist it. Chapter 1591. After those creatures were separated, they were all indescribably shocked. The world composed of various concepts in front of them had completely subverted their concepts. None of the endless concepts in front of them was a high-level concept that they couldn't understand. Moreover, their strength was only a little bit stronger than what they had mastered. However, such a vast, complete, and indescribably perfect world constructed from countless concepts was already far beyond the scope of their understanding. Everything in this conceptual world could be on par with the most powerful offensive methods they had mastered. This kind of balance made the advantage of their most powerful attack completely disappear at this moment. This made the attack that could make them absolutely invincible against existences that didn't have such an attack become an ordinary one. Under such circumstances, they sank into this world and were completely controlled by the other party. It was easy to imagine how terrible it was for them to be completely under the other party's control. At this moment, after almost all the creatures recovered from their shock, their faces were filled with terror. At that moment, Luo Fan had already begun to control the changes in the world, constantly guiding the various concepts around the bodies of these creatures away. Not only were those concepts unable to cause any damage to the world, but they had also become a part of the structure of the world, gradually being devoured by the world. Fused in the past, Luo Fan's actions could only make this world connect with them. In the end, this world might even be occupied by them. However, it was different this time. At this moment, the power that Luo Fan guided and summoned was almost endless. This made the fundamental concept of this conceptual world continuously strengthen, and it was also the main body that could control the entire conceptual world. On the other hand, the concept that these living beings could emit was like a tree without roots or water without a source. Although it looked powerful, it was not as powerful as it seemed. Although they looked powerful now, they couldn't last long. How many concepts could they send out? The more they lost, the more they consumed, the less they would have in the end. In this way, these concepts were scattered and devoured by this conceptual world. How could they allow these devoured concepts to occupy the main body of this conceptual world? How could they allow these creatures to control this world? Although this process wasn't too complicated, it was extremely complicated. From the beginning to the end, when all the concepts were completely scattered, it still took nearly a month before they stopped. During this month, those creatures didn't just sit and wait for death. Instead, they were still trying hard to find the weaknesses of this conceptual world, trying hard to change the concepts around them. They wanted to use the changes in concepts to attack this conceptual world and find a way to escape from this conceptual world. However, all their efforts were ultimately defeated by the degree of perfection of this conceptual world. Because of its perfection, ever since this conceptual world was formed, all the rules and principles operated naturally. All of the rules and laws operated naturally, and the conceptual Great Tao began to control all the minute changes in the world at the same time. No matter how the creatures tried to control the concepts around them, they couldn't escape the control of this conceptual world. In the end, they became a part of this conceptual world's operation. They didn't even need Luo Fan to deal with them. They naturally merged with the world according to the operation of this conceptual world. On this day, 1 month later, Luo Fan felt that the entire conceptual world was empty. Immediately after, all the living creatures in it let out inexplicable cries. Each and every one of them had been completely sealed by this concept of heaven and earth. When he sensed such a change in this conceptual world, Luo Fan heaved a long sigh of relief. With a raise of his hand and a grab, the entire conceptual world collapsed. All the concepts disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. It looked like they had never appeared before. At this moment, there were dozens of statue-like figures in the void. At this moment, the 11 pseudo-saints between this normal space-time and that inexplicable place felt their bodies lighten. An unprecedented sense of ease surged up. It's finally over. At this moment, the 11 pseudo-saints came to a realization. During the battle between Luo Fan and those living creatures, although those living creatures had only used the power they had left in their bodies to fight against the enemy and didn't successfully guide the power from that inexplicable place, it didn't mean that they had given up on this effort. At the moment of life and death, how could they give up on trying to exert their strongest power? In other words, during that period of time, they had been trying to guide the power down at all times and were constantly preparing to communicate with that inexplicable place. And this was obviously constantly attacking the seal of the 11 pseudo-saints. During this entire month, it could be said that if these pseudo-saints relaxed even a little, their seal would completely collapse, causing the many living creatures to connect with that inexplicable place and guide and summon the power that was enough to pose a huge threat to Luo Fan and Alai. Therefore, it could be said that during this entire month, the 11 pseudo-saints, who had just become pseudo-saints, could be said to have been fighting with Luo Fan against the many living creatures. In this way, it went without saying how tired they were. It could even be said that the fact that they didn't make any mistakes during this period of time and didn't let those living creatures connect with that inexplicable place showed that their willpower was extremely firm. Luo Fan looked at the hundreds of sealed living creatures in front of him. With a thought, he waved his hand. In an instant, the many seals sank down, scattering the hundreds of living creatures and sinking to the ground. Moreover, during this process, these seals changed those living creatures one by one, With this change, regardless of the original size of these living creatures, all of them began to enlarge rapidly. Not long after, these living creatures had already turned into huge mountains and landed on the ground with a loud bang, causing the entire ground to rumble. Faint, inexplicable ripples spread out from those mountains and swept through the entire civilized country, causing the entire civilized country to tremble. However, amidst this tremor, the entire civilized country seemed to have become stronger. It had become even stronger. Although these mountains were mountains, their appearance was still that of their original living creatures. From afar, it looked like those living creatures had grown bigger and were lying there. It was impossible to tell that they were much different from normal. After Luo Fan placed these living creatures down, his heart stirred. As he raised his hand and waved it gently, a strong light naturally emitted from these living creatures. These lights were all different. Every living creature had their own corresponding light, and they were all completely different from any other light. After this light was emitted, it directly penetrated the void. It faintly linked together and gradually formed an inexplicable protective force that began to firmly protect the spacetime within the entire civilized country. This caused the spacetime within the entire civilized country to become several times stronger than before. At this moment, the 11 pseudo-saints in the strange existence all felt this change. The feeling of being stronger and more relaxed than before made them feel indescribable surprise. After a while, after Luo Fan finished turning these living creatures into the source and setting up an inexplicable array formation, the pseudo-saints walked out of the strange existence and appeared in the void. They bowed to Gui Shou and said, "Greetings, Creator." Upon hearing this, Gui Shou could not help but laugh. He was obviously quite satisfied with the attitude of these pseudo-saints. He smiled and said, "There's no need to go so far. Quickly come and greet my master." As he said that, he brought the 11 pseudo-saints across the void and arrived in front of Luo Fan. He first bowed to Luo Fan and thanked him for his help. The 11 pseudo-sages already knew everything. At this moment, they did not have any surprised expressions. They also bowed to Luo Fan, but they did not call him master. Instead, they called him Sage Master. To them, Luo Fan was the source of their body template and the ruler of their creator. Naturally, he was their Saint Master. Luo Fan did not care about how they addressed him. As for them paying their respects to Gui Shou first before coming to see him, he did not mind at all. He only smiled faintly and said to them, "You guys are already the main characters of this world, but you can't set your sights on this small country. Outside this country, there are still countless of your kind being born. You guys need to expand well." Regarding this, the 11 false saints looked troubled. One of them said, "Sage Master's words are naturally reasonable. However, with our current strength, it's a little difficult for us to protect our race in this country. If we leave this country, our strength will be greatly reduced. I'm afraid we'll encounter unstoppable dangers before we can go far and be killed by other living creatures." The other pseudo-saints nodded continuously at this moment, clearly feeling the same. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled and said, "Even so, your responsibility is your responsibility. Even if it's dangerous, you guys have to do it. Otherwise, this world will not favor you guys. The main characters are not unchanging." When these pseudo-saints heard Luo Fan's words, their expressions turned solemn. They bowed and said, "Thank you for your guidance, Saint Master." Luo Fan nodded with a smile. While they were talking, Qing Yi and Yu Ji had already arrived. At this moment, the two of them were also suppressed by this world. However, compared to the other living creatures that could come from that inexplicable place, the suppression they suffered was not as strong. At this moment, they could still use the technique that Luo Fan had taught them to sense that inexplicable place. Through this sense, they could guide power and condense a similar power, but it was not power. They could use it to attack their opponents, defend against their opponents, and even do everything else they wanted to do. At this moment, when the two of them saw these pseudo-saints, their expressions were a little complicated. One had to know. These living creatures were originally existences that could compete with the living creatures that the two of them had created. Originally, in their eyes, he was just an ant, a weakling. But now, although these living creatures were still a little weaker than them in this range, they no longer had any ability to resist. If these living creatures wanted to, it would be an extremely simple and easy thing to kill them directly. This was a huge change in strength. However, it made the two of them unable to balance their mentality for a moment. This kind of unbalanced mentality was the root cause of their complicated expressions at this moment. You guys can't do it now. Can you cultivate? With your exceptional status, it would be a piece of cake for you to improve your strength. What's there to worry about? At this moment, Yuji heard the worries of those pseudo-saints. She said disdainfully. Hearing her words, the eyes of those pseudo-saints lit up slightly. What Yuji said was not a very obscure secret. In fact, they could even figure it out if they thought about it for a while. However, because the shock that Luo Fan and the other living creatures brought them was too strong and the pressure they brought was too terrifying, they did not think about it for a while. At this moment, after being reminded by Yuji, they truly realized what their status as the main characters of this world could bring. Naturally, the look in his eyes would change accordingly. Luo Fan did not think much about their conversation. Seeing that these pseudo-saints had regained their confidence, he said, "It's naturally necessary for you guys to improve your own strength, but don't forget to nurture other living creatures. Now is the moment when you guys have just become the main characters of this world. However, this is the moment when the world favors you the most. If you take advantage of this period of time to cultivate hard, even other living creatures that can't become pseudo-saints will have a high chance of becoming pseudo-saints. Don't forget this." Yes. Those pseudo-saints naturally agreed loudly. After agreeing, a pseudo-saint said with some difficulty, "How did we become pseudo-saints? Right now we are all in a daze. If we want to teach other living creatures the method to become pseudo-saints, I'm afraid we won't be able to do it." What he meant was that he clearly wanted Luo Fan to preach to them and teach them the method to become pseudo-saints. Luo Fan naturally knew this the moment he heard it. However, Luo Fan was unwilling to be their nanny. Even if he could do such a thing, how could he be willing to do it? One had to know that he had his own cultivation. Therefore, he only smiled and said, "This your creator will naturally teach you." Gue Shou was originally smiling as he listened to the conversation between the pseudo-saints and Luo Fan. However, when he suddenly realized that he was being burned, he was stunned for a moment. His eyes were filled with disbelief, as if he was saying, "Me?" Seeing this, Luo Fan only smiled but did not say a word. Hearing what Luo Fan said, the pseudo-saints could not help but come to a realization. They hurriedly turned around and bowed to Gue Shou, saying, "Creator, please have mercy and teach us the method to become saints." Gue Shou opened his mouth. He really wanted to say that he was also confused and did not know what to do. However, when he saw Luo Fan's faint smile and the anticipation and urgency of the pseudo-saints around him, he could not help but sigh. In the end, he could not say such words and could only say, "Go and consolidate your realm first. I will naturally preach the Tao." "Thank you, Creator." The pseudo-saints were overjoyed. "Since you've already said it, go," Luo Fan said calmly at this moment. Since Luo Fan had already spoken, how could the pseudo-saints say anything else? Naturally, he hurriedly kowtowed to Luo Fan and Gue Shou. After saying goodbye, he turned around and took a light step, directly leaving this place, directly returning to the civilized country to open up their Taoist right grounds. As for the living beings in this civilized country, there was no need for them to deal with them. Who knew how many billions of living beings would naturally be reborn into order, and a perfect society would naturally be formed. Although the entire process would be a little chaotic without them, in the end, The order would become more stable, more complete, and more livelier because of their absence. These pseudo-saints were naturally very clear about this. Of course, they would not waste their time on such unnecessary things. They would waste their energy. In fact, even if they had to deal with it, they might not be bothered, after all. Compared to the order of this civilized country, their cultivation was more important. As long as their cultivation realm could be improved slightly, it would be more significant to the entire civilized country than the order of this civilized country. After the pseudo-saints left, Gui Shou directly said to Luo Fan, "Master, how would I know the method to become a saint? Your current realm is higher than theirs. This method to become a saint is only a low-level mystery to you. As long as you spend some time studying it, you will naturally understand," Luo Fan said directly. "Listen to this." Gui Shou smiled bitterly and said, "I'm not the master. I don't have the slightest confidence in this kind of research ability." Gui Shou, this is a good opportunity for you to show off. How can you let it go? Green Wing chuckled. That kind of gloating expression, however, was not the least bit concealed. Gui Shou felt even more helpless when he heard that. As a native living being of this world, he had only seen the false saints when he saw the 11 false saints previously. How exactly did a false sage become a false sage? That was a question that was at a lower level than his current level. The principles and profundities contained within were also principles and profundities that he had already surpassed long ago. However, he didn't know much about the pseudo-sage. How could he possibly know what principles and what mysteries should be used to form this way of sainthood? At this moment, he was completely confused and at a loss. He didn't know where to start. "Master." Gui Shou turned around and looked at Luo Fan. He wanted to make Luo Fan take back his order. However, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, "You are their creator. They have their responsibilities, but you have yours too. Let them have more and more power. This is your responsibility." "Are you trying to shirk your responsibility?" Gui Shou actually wanted to say yes, but he knew that Luo Fan would definitely not be satisfied with such words. Therefore, he could only swallow this word and say helplessly, "I understand." As he said that, he bowed and bade farewell. He turned around and stepped out, directly arriving at the most central mountain peak in the civilized country. In a palace that he had opened up a long time ago but did not stay there for long, he began to go into seclusion to study the way of sainthood. "Master, will there be a problem with this?" Green Wing looked at Gui Shou as somewhat dazed back and asked nervously. Although she seemed to be gloating in front of Gui Shou, she had a good relationship with him, after all. Seeing that Gui Shou seemed to be very unconfident, she was still a little worried. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled and said, "Of course there will be no problem. He is the creator of those creatures. In fact, his understanding of those creatures is more than you can imagine. As long as he creates according to his own ideas and his own instincts, he will naturally be able to create the most suitable way of sainthood for those creatures, even if that way of sainthood may not be the most perfect." Qing Yi and Yu Ji heaved a sigh of relief when they heard Luo Fan's answer. After that, the two of them looked like they were rejoicing in the misfortune of others. As long as there was no fundamental problem, they were more willing to let Gui Shou encounter some trouble and suffer some losses. Seeing that the two of them were like this, Luo Fan could not help but laugh. Thinking about this, he turned his head and looked outside the civilized country. At this moment, he could clearly feel that the world outside the civilized country was also undergoing an inexplicable change. An increasingly rich vitality was beginning to be born between heaven and earth. Moreover, he could also sense an extremely familiar smell in that vitality. It was a smell that could only appear in this civilized country at this moment. Only when there was vitality would the world give birth to creatures. And the corresponding vitality determined the birth of corresponding creatures. The vitality that existed the most in the civilized country obviously meant that the creatures that were eventually born from that vitality were very likely to be born in this civilized country, and were currently the real protagonists of this world, the creatures with natural Taoism aptitude. Chapter 1592. Luo Fan's final calculation result made him involuntarily reveal an inexplicable smile. According to his calculation, this world would give birth to creatures of the same race as the ones that Gui Shou had created in this civilized country. However, the density of these creatures would be thousands of times higher than what he had imagined. He had originally thought that such a race would be born in a region with a circumference of billions of miles. Then, they would continue to expand and develop. Finally, they would link up with each other and form a vast country that would occupy every inch of the world. Then, they would become the true protagonist of this world. However, according to his current calculation, such creatures would be born in a region that was more than 10 million miles away. Moreover, according to the calculation of this vitality, even if these living beings disappeared, even if they died, the world would very quickly recreate them, if they continued to maintain this density. It seems that this world is extremely desperate for the appearance of this world's protagonist. This thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind at this moment. Suddenly, an inexplicable feeling came from the void. This feeling was as if an indescribable will had descended here. This kind of will was faintly discernible, but it was vast and boundless, profound and unfathomable. It felt like if even a trace of it materialized, it would be enough to bring about an incomparably great threat to him and put his life in danger. "Who is it?" Luo Fan shouted softly. The strength of this will. It made him extremely shocked. He could not even imagine how powerful an existence with such a will must be. If someone told him that this will was the will of a true saint, he would definitely believe it without hesitation. Qing Yi's and Yu Zhi's expressions changed slightly when they heard that soft shout. Their strength and perception were far inferior to Luo Fan's. Luo Fan could feel the existence of that faintly discernible strong will, but they could not feel it at all. To them, Luo Fan at this moment, it was as if he was overreacting and suddenly shouted such a sentence. However, obviously, although they felt that Luo Fan seemed to be overreacting, their rationality told them that their master, Luo Fan, definitely did not overreact. Given his reaction, there was definitely something that had appeared here. Something that was beyond his control had definitely appeared. That was the only reason why Luo Fan would have such an expression and reaction. Knowing this, how could they not be nervous? One had to know that compared to Luo Fan, they were really as weak as ants. Something that even Luo Fan had to deal with so nervously was even more difficult for them to control and deal with. Luo Fan shouted softly. It spread far and wide, directly penetrating into the void, almost to the endless distance. He believed that no matter where the owner of that will was, no matter how far away he was from here, he would definitely hear this shout. However, the will did not change in the slightest because of this. It was still faintly discernible in the surroundings. He was still observing him as if he was observing an ant. At this moment, Luo Fan did not even have the feeling that he was being seen through. This, of course, was not because this will was weaker than the flood dragon that gave him such a feeling, but because this will was many times stronger than the flood dragon's will. It was so strong that even Luo Fan himself could not feel what effect this will had on him. It was so strong that even if he felt the existence of this will, he could not detect its effect on him at all. Seeing that there was no response from this will, Luo Fan's heart moved. An unknown amount of power was guided down from that unknown place, directly turning into a concept of heaven and earth. It turned into a long robe that draped over his body, directly isolating him from everything in the outside world. At this moment, that will seemed to be slightly separated because of this change. Who is it? Luo Fan's expression was still extremely ugly as he shouted again. However, what awaited him was still a period of silence. Luo Fan frowned and began to activate his wisdom. He thought frantically and searched frantically, trying to find the source of this will. He wanted to understand what kind of existence was emitting this will, and what exactly was that will thinking. It was a pity that the will was too profound and obscure. At this moment, Luo Fan could not find the truth of that will at all. It was as if he was really overreacting and there was no will at all. Just as Luo Fan was about to ask for the third time, an inexplicable change suddenly appeared. That faintly discernible and unfathomable wisdom suddenly increased by many times. In an instant it produced an earth-shattering power that directly crushed him. The strength of this will was almost the first time Luo Fan had seen such a strong will since he stepped onto the path of cultivation. Not to mention the false saints and the desperate ones that he had seen before, even existences like the Jin Emperor seemed to be much weaker than this will. Under this will, Luo Fan felt that the conceptual world that appeared around his body could not withstand the pressure of that will immediately. With a loud bang, it had completely collapsed. Moreover, the countless concepts that had collapsed were once again crushed by that will and directly collapsed into nothingness. They simply disappeared without a trace. At this moment, Luo Fan felt as if his soul was being hammered by a giant hammer and crushed crazily. Waves of inexplicable dizziness surged up. Even his life essence seemed to be rattling at this moment, as if it would completely collapse in the next moment and be directly annihilated. An unprecedented strong sense of life crisis surged up from the bottom of his heart. At this moment, he really felt that he was facing death. He really had the feeling that this moment was the last moment of his life. What a strong will! But it's still not a true sage. I'm still far from it. At this moment, what Luo Fan had was not the various kinds of fear and distracting thoughts that ordinary living beings would have when they were about to die. Instead, he had such a thought. Although this will was strong, terrifying, and had incredible power, it did not have the aura of a true sage. Although it felt several levels higher than the level that Luo Fan could reach now, it was still a level that he could see from afar. And this, obviously, it was not the performance that a true sage-level willpower should have. Just when Luo Fan thought that he was going to die in the next moment, that will suddenly shrank. It returned to its original faintly discernible state. It was still that unfathomable and incomprehensible state, but it brought him a huge deterrent. And all the danger and pain that Luo Fan felt, it also disappeared completely in an instant. Is it going to say something? Luo Fan murmured. At this moment, that will turned, and almost without wasting any time, it had already swept past the living beings that he had sealed into mountains to protect this civilized country. As this will swept past, most of those living beings began to shake violently. Immediately after, the seal that Luo Fan had originally sealed them for eternity was broken. Those living beings looked up to the sky and howled, and their bodies directly rushed into the void. All of them looked at Luo Fan with a fierce gaze. With a glance, Luo Fan knew that these living beings were not others. They were the living beings of that big organization. And the remaining nearly half, which was a few hundred living beings, did not belong to this big organization. In other words, they were the living beings of other organizations that had invaded this area. At this moment, Luo Fan had a guess about the identity of the owner of that will. For the living beings of this big organization, they helped them escape. As for the living beings that do not belong to this organization, they don't care about them, and they are so powerful. Come to think of it, this should be the strongest person of this big organization, the unfathomable and mysterious leader. This thought flashed through his mind. The living beings of the big organization had been rescued, but this was not a good thing for Luo Fan. The most direct thing was that the array formation he had set up to protect the entire civilized country had been destroyed at this moment, and its power had been greatly reduced. If he wanted to continue using it, he would have to rearrange the remaining sealed living beings and rebuild the array formation. "The next time we meet, I will definitely take revenge for today," the 9-headed, 13-armed living being said calmly. As he said that, he turned around and flew away with a cold expression. The other living beings also looked at Luo Fan with extremely ugly expressions, but none of them said anything harsh. They just turned around and left one by one. To these creatures, they needed the help of their leader in order to escape and ascend to the heavens. Only then could they be safe. This was simply too humiliating. Under such circumstances, how could they have the face to say anything harsh? Only the 9-headed, 13-armed being, who had suffered far too many losses, could not hold back the anger in his heart and speak such ruthless words. At this moment, Luo Fan only smiled bitterly. If not for the faintly discernible powerful will that still existed and seemed to still be eyeing him covetously, how could he have let these living beings leave so easily? One had to know that at this moment, the strength of these living beings had been greatly reduced, and it was extremely easy to deal with them. Once they left the range of this civilized country, these living beings would be like fish in the sea or birds flying in the sky. The difficulty of dealing with them would increase by at least 100 times. Almost in the blink of an eye, those living beings had already disappeared from Luo Fan's sight and left the range of this civilized country. However, they had a tacit understanding. They each opened up their own nests not far away from this civilized country and stayed there. After suffering such a great loss, even if they did not say anything harsh, they could not swallow their anger at this moment. When all of these creatures left, that faintly discernible, yet incomparably powerful and boundless will that could even easily crush Luo Fan, making him feel as if his life would disappear in the next instant, also disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. After everything disappeared, Luo Fan let out a slight sigh. "Master, what happened just now?" Yuji asked carefully. Although she could not sense the existence of that will, she and Qing-Yi had seen everything clearly. However, she and Qing-Yi had clearly witnessed everything that had happened earlier. Naturally, they knew that there was definitely some sort of existence that had appeared here. Moreover, their master could not control it at all and could not resist it. How could she not be curious at this moment? When Luo Fan heard this, he shook his head and said, "A true expert's will descended here and saved those living beings." "A true expert?" Yuji cried out in surprise. For Yuji, there was no doubt that Luo Fan was powerful. His ability was enough to make people despair. His various almost omnipotent means were already beyond her wildest dreams. But how could she accept the words "true expert" coming out of Luo Fan's mouth at this moment? Luo Fan sighed and said, "That's right. We are still too weak." After sighing, he shook his head and raised his hand. In an instant, the numerous sealed living beings that still existed in this civilized country in the form of mountains left the ground one by one and began to wander around this civilized country. The entire process was extremely mysterious and profound. Among them, the trajectory of each and every mountain peak contained an indescribable principle. It contained profound mysteries that could allow all living beings to soar into the heavens with a single leap. The hundreds of mountains wandered like this for dozens of breaths. After a slight pause, it descended and landed on the ground, creating an extremely mysterious formation in the civilized country. It directly produced an indescribable might, and it faintly connected with the entire civilized country. It strengthened the various aspects of this civilized nation by countless times. Of course, compared to before those living beings were rescued, the extent of this strengthening was obviously not as great as before. This was unavoidable. While Luo Fan was doing this, Qing-Yi and Yuji, who were nearby, were a little stunned. At this moment, the two of them had countless doubts and questions to ask Luo Fan. However, when they saw that Luo Fan was completely uninterested in answering them, they could only forcefully hold back their questions. That feeling was indescribably unbearable. After he finished setting up the formation, Luo Fan lifted his foot and took a light step forward. His figure had already returned to the mountain peak, back to the palace that he had stayed in for an unknown period of time. Qing Yi and Yu Ji stayed there and looked at each other. They wanted to chase after him, but they knew that Luo Fan was not too willing to see them now. What should we do now? Yu Ji finally asked. What else can we do? Continue to strengthen the world. Qing Yi sighed. After the two of them came to an agreement, they did not hesitate to take a step forward. Their figures crossed an unknown number of millions of miles and directly returned to one of the 30 million worlds that they had opened up. It was one of the worlds that had not been strengthened yet. Although the living beings that they had created had already lost in the war for the leading role of the world. However, this did not mean that all the worlds that they had opened up had been lost. In fact, it was the opposite. None of the 30 million worlds had been damaged, and it was still the same as before the war broke out. If there was anything different, it would be that the worlds that they had created living beings with born Taoism aptitude no longer had any living beings with born Taoism aptitude. The reason for this was very simple. Although they had opened up so many worlds and created so many living beings, not all living beings and all worlds were recognized by the world as part of the civilized country. The world only recognized living beings with born Taoism aptitude as part of the civilized country. In other words, they were only candidates for the leading role of the world. Because of this, the failure of the living beings that Qing Yi and Yu Ji had created in the fight for the leading role of the world only caused the living beings with born Taoism aptitude to completely disappear. It did not affect living beings that did not have born Taoism aptitude, nor did it affect the worlds that did not have born Taoism aptitude. That was the reason for the current situation. From this point of view, although living beings that did not have born Taoism aptitude had lost the opportunity to become the leading role of the world, it was also because of this that they had survived. Although living beings with born Taoism aptitude had a chance to soar into the sky and become the leading role of the world, it was also because of this that they had been completely wiped out at this time. It was difficult to tell which was luckier and which was better. After the battles that Qing Yi and Yu Ji had witnessed, they now had a very clear understanding of their own weakness. Although they were constantly strengthening those worlds, they did not stop cultivating at the same time. They were not living beings that were born with intelligence in this world, so they could not come into contact with that unknown place like those living beings and guide the power from that unknown place. However, they had the methods that Luo Fan had imparted to them, and Luo Fan had guided them in their cultivation. This allowed them to not lose their direction because of this, and they were able to continuously advance along the path of cultivation that Luo Fan had planned for them. This allowed them to not lose their direction because of this, and they were able to continuously advance along the path of cultivation that Luo Fan had planned for them. In particular, after witnessing the battle between Luo Fan and those living beings this time, they were even more inspired by the methods of many living beings. They had gained a lot of inspiration from Luo Fan's methods. At this moment, as they entered the path of cultivation, these inspirations would pop up from time to time, making them feel that their path forward seemed to be getting wider and wider. It was getting easier and easier. This made them even more immersed in their cultivation, and they gradually forgot about everything in the outside world. While the two of them were strengthening the world and cultivating at the same time, Luo Fan, who was in the palace, had already started cultivating. This time, his cultivation was no longer the same as before, where he entered that unknown place to comprehend the mysteries of the true sage to perfect his worldview. Instead, he worked hard to cultivate according to the rules of the worldview, to improve his cultivation realm. Although perfecting the rules of the worldview was the foundation for him to become a sage, to him, it was more important than the cultivation realm. However, before he became a true sage, the significance of the cultivation realm to him could not be underestimated. Not only did the rules of the worldview need to be transformed into the cultivation realm to allow him to step into the true sage level and become truly eternal and indestructible. Omnipotent and omniscient. He was an omniscient existence. More importantly, if he could not quickly convert his potential into strength, he could encounter a disaster at any time in this dangerous world. Not to mention anything else, just the willpower that easily made him feel that his life was in danger was not something that he could resist at the moment. If he did not transform the improvement of the rules of the worldview into the cultivation realm, how could he have the ability to resist the willpower the next time he encountered it? The rules of the worldview was the absolute foundation. Cultivating according to the rules of the worldview was simply like following a map, and there were no obstacles or bottlenecks along the way. At this moment, in Luo Fan's heart, countless profound mysteries of the true sage had been completely understood by him after a slight analysis based on the description of the worldview. The various combinations and the mysteries of the combinations were also easily analyzed by him in this process, and all these mysteries eventually turned into resources to strengthen the essence of his life, turning into a driving force that pushed his life origin to grow, so that all these things were gradually strengthened as time passed. Looking at it from another angle, all of these enhancements caused his cultivation level to continuously increase. In this kind of strengthening, without any bottlenecks and obstacles, Luo Fan's body gradually emitted an indescribable aura. This aura was so pure, so condensed, and with a slight fluctuation, it made Luo Fan feel like he had merged with heaven and earth, but also transcended heaven and earth. This aura did not spread out endlessly. After it left Luo Fan's body, it just continued to accumulate in this palace. It was as if the walls of this palace had the absolute effect of isolating auras. This aura was so profound that as it continued to accumulate in this palace, it gradually changed the spacetime in this palace. This kind of change did not cause many strange worlds to appear in this palace. In fact, the degree of condensation of this aura was so pure that it could not even contain the world that it had transformed into. Chapter 1593. Time passed by slowly. Novel. In the blink of an eye, thousands of years had passed. During these thousands of years, the development speed of the entire civilized country had almost reached the peak in history. In just a short 1,000 years, it had already completed the development that might not have been able to be completed in the past hundreds of thousands of years. After the development of the entire civilized country, its territory had already expanded by more than 3 times. Although it was still insignificant compared to the world that was changed when the 11 false saints became false saints and had yet to reach the limit, its power was no longer something that could be compared to 1,000 years ago. However, in this civilized country, it was not a unified country. Instead, there were countless countries of various sizes. These countries competed with each other, and there was no lack of wars of various sizes. However, due to the suppression of the 11 false saints, the scale of these wars was limited to a small area. This scale of war did not cause a disaster to the entire civilized country. Instead, it formed a kind of pushing force, causing the development of the civilized country to become faster and faster. The light of all kinds of wisdom was constantly surging, causing the situation of the civilized country to continuously change. It could be said that the current appearance of the entire civilized country was completely different from 1,000 years ago. Although the cultivation civilization did not improve much compared to before, the number of powerhouses in it had increased by countless times. There were such changes in this civilized country. Outside this civilized country, in every corner of the world, there were also small civilized countries appearing one after another. Because these civilized countries were separated and independent from each other, the civilizations that they developed were all different. They had all kinds of strange characteristics. However, No matter what kind of civilization they were, their potential was extremely huge. Moreover, although most of the civilizations had bumps in the entire development process and encountered the danger of being wiped out many times, in the end, they all turned out well. They narrowly escaped death. After passing through all the difficulties and going through many failures, they finally allowed these civilized countries to continuously develop and grow stronger. Until now, although they had not completely gained a foothold in their respective places of birth, at the very least, they were no longer so easily destroyed. Their resistance and ability to protect themselves had already reached an extremely high level. Of course, this was the development of most of the civilized countries outside of this civilized country. However, there were also many civilized countries that had been crushed and annihilated by the living beings that were filled with hostility towards them. In the end, only ruins were left all over the world. In fact, in comparison, the civilizations that had been crushed and wiped out were not much worse than the civilizations that had narrowly escaped death. It could be said to be half and half. What emerged from these changes was a chapter of blood and fire, and what was reflected was a tenacious fighting spirit. Compared to this vast civilized country that was guarded by 11 sages, the civilized countries that grew up independently in the outside world faced greater dangers because of the harsh environment. Therefore, every country that could survive was stronger than the one that was guarded, and their ability to protect themselves was also stronger. From the looks of it, its potential was even stronger than the civilization in the center. 1,000 years was an extremely long period of time for an ordinary nation. It was enough to change dynasties 2 or 3 times. However, in this world, in the face of this boundless land and the environment of countless powerful living beings that could easily crush them, 1,000 years was so short. In such a short period of time, the many independent civilized countries outside of the civilized countries did not have their previous inheritances. Although they had developed various cultivation civilizations, allowing them to obtain strong resistance abilities. However, those cultivation civilizations were extremely crude. Until now, no living being had been able to raise their strength to the pseudo-sage level through cultivation. It was naturally extremely difficult to raise one to the pseudo-sage level in other worlds, and it might take billions of years to do so. However, this was not the case in this world. This world was filled with endless true sage mysteries and great Tao fragments. As long as one knew how to use these, it was extremely easy to raise one's cultivation realm. Normally speaking, if an existence like Luo Fan was thrown into this world as an ordinary person, as long as he could survive, 1,000 years would be enough for him to grow to the peak of the level 9 pseudo-sage level. He might even become a pseudo-sage directly if he was not careful. Under such a background, there were billions of living beings in the many civilized countries, but not a single one could reach the pseudo-sage level. This was enough to show how crude the cultivation civilizations that were born in these civilized countries were. However, this was obviously unavoidable. The emergence of a cultivation civilization was definitely a process from scratch, from crude to fine, from weak to prosperous. If there was no inheritance, it would be impossible for a civilization to grow to such a prosperous state as soon as it was born. Even in this world, it would take hundreds of thousands of years for the cultivation civilizations of those civilized countries to grow to the point where they could give birth to pseudo-sages. It was only a short 1,000 years, and it was still far from that. Your Majesty, many strange weak living beings have suddenly appeared in this area. I can vaguely sense an inexplicable sense of danger from them. I don't know if I should eliminate them. In a strange space-time in this world, such a voice sounded. This space-time was billions of light-years away from the area where Luo Fan was. Moreover, this entire space-time was hidden in the void and looked chaotic. The mysteries of true divinity and the fragments of great Tao were piled up in an extremely strange and mysterious state, faintly forming that indescribable state. Of course, however, it was only faintly discernible. Compared to the true inexplicable existence, it was still an immeasurable distance away. At this moment, the one who spoke in this spacetime was a living being that looked like a wild boar with long horns. At this moment, this living being was lying at the edge of this spacetime respectfully. And in the center of this spacetime, above the position that seemed to be filled with the mysteries of true sages and the endless great Tao fragments slowly rotated, a living being that looked like a human and vaguely had the characteristics of a connate Tao aptitude sat cross-legged. This living being. It seemed to be a young man. It also seemed to be an old man. It seemed to be a man, but it also seemed to be a woman. It even gave people a feeling that they would completely forget the next moment when they turned their heads away. At this moment, it listened to the words of the long-horned wild boar. It slowly opened its eyes. Its eyes contained earth-shattering wisdom. At the moment it opened its eyes, wisps of willpower seeped out from its eyes and directly disturbed this spacetime. The operation of the mysteries of true sages that were simulating the inexplicable existence directly formed an inexplicable chaos. This willpower existed for a while before it was retracted. Immediately afterward, endless light and shadows were reflected in its eyes, showing a vast and boundless land. It also showed the large and small civilized countries that had appeared on the vast land, and there were also countless living beings with connate Tao aptitude in the civilized countries that were evolving the various forms of the mortal world. These various lights and shadows lasted for a long time before they were annihilated. Then, the living being said, "Ignore it." This voice was like thunder, like the sound of the great Tao, and more like a kind of concept attack. As soon as it appeared, the originally chaotic mysteries of true sages and great Tao fragments in this spacetime all collapsed. Above the edge of this spacetime, the body of the long-horned wild boar-like creature shook violently, and the power in its body surged violently. Wisps of concepts emerged from its body, and it struggled to resist the surrounding sound wave. Its eyes were filled with indescribable pain. After a long time, when the sound waves disappeared, the surrounding mysteries of true sages and great Tao fragments began to recondense as if time had reversed. After evolving again, the various changes that had occurred to its body finally calmed down, and a hint of relief appeared on its face. At this moment, it finally understood what its emperor was talking about. Immediately, it did not dare to delay and bowed in response. It glanced at this spacetime with some reluctance, and gradually disappeared in this spacetime. It was directly thrown out. After the wild boar-like creature disappeared, the living being in the center murmured, "I still can't control my power." These words caused the entire spacetime to instantly collapse, causing the spacetime to fall into the deepest layer of chaos. After a long while, the spacetime slowly recovered due to the disappearance of the sound waves, and once again revealed the appearance of the scene in the inexplicable place. At this moment, a wisp of foreign intent suddenly appeared in this spacetime. Although this wisp of intent was extremely small, its essence was unimaginably high. Once it appeared, it caused the spacetime that had just returned to normal to collapse again, and it once again fell into absolute chaos. The living being in the center felt the arrival of this intent, and its eyelids twitched. "Emperor, what are you doing here? Nuclear Emperor, do you really not know why I'm here?" A faint voice came from that wisp of intent. This voice was like the voice of the living being in this spacetime, and it once again pushed the chaotic scene into an abyss of chaos, causing the chaos to become even more severe, to the point that it could not recover in a short period of time. "Cut the crap," the living being called the Nuclear Emperor said faintly. "You really don't want to care about those living beings? You must know that they are going to become the new main characters of this world. If we wait for them to develop to their limits, we might be overthrown and reduced to dust," the wisp of intent said. "Reduced to dust? I'm not as unconfident as you are," the Nuclear Emperor said faintly. "How is this a matter of confidence? This is the law of this world." The Emperor, who was also the owner of that wisp of intent, continued to speak. As the two of them spoke, all sorts of terrifying powers directly collided and stirred up the entire spacetime. It caused the chaos in this spacetime to deepen. Vaguely, it had already revealed a chaotic characteristic. This wasn't because this chaos directly formed a state of chaos. Instead, when this chaos reached its limit, it would eventually cause the spacetime to collapse, revealing what was beneath the spacetime, or rather, what was behind the spacetime. The characteristics of the chaotic state had come out. In such an environment, if the longhorn wild boar had appeared here, it might have been completely crushed by this chaos. Of course, it was also possible that he could hold out for a longer period of time. But in the end, it was forced into a chaotic state by this terrifying might. In the end, all traces of its existence were completely erased. A new main character. What does the old protagonist have to do with us? For me, the most important thing right now is, it was cultivation. It was to break through the current bottleneck. Don't tell me you're not like that? The nuclear emperor didn't say anything about being confident or beating him to the ground. Instead, he asked directly, "How heartless?" Emperor Neng let out a long sigh. "You are not heartless. If you're not heartless, then why don't you attack?" The nuclear emperor said nonchalantly. "Haha." That will let out a faint laugh. Then, that wisp of will slowly disappeared. In the end, it disappeared as abruptly as it had appeared. After it disappeared, the various fragments of the true saint mysteries and great Tao fragments in this spacetime began to distort with great difficulty. Bit by bit, they condensed and reconstructed. In the end, it took a long time for them to return to their original state. Then, they slowly revolved around the nuclear emperor in the center like before. He did not know if it was an illusion, but the mysteries of the true saint and the fragments of the great Tao that had been formed seemed to be even purer and more condensed than before. The scene that had been created seemed to be even more similar to the scene that had been created. The nuclear emperor didn't care about any of this. At this moment, a faint sneer appeared on his face as he muttered, "You want to use me as cannon fodder? Do you really think I'm stupid?" Along with this voice, the space-time that had just recovered began to collapse again. It took a long time for it to condense and return to its original state. However, if one calculated the time it took for it to collapse and condense, one would find that the speed of condensing seemed to have increased a little compared to before. After this change, the nuclear emperor began to close his eyes again. In the entire space-time, aside from the true saint mysteries and the great Tao fragments, there was no other movement. Just as the conversation that would decide the fate of a civilized nation occurred in an unknown space and time, a new change occurred in the central civilized nation. On this day, a powerful aura suddenly soared into the sky from the palace that Guai Shou was in. This aura broke through the layers of clouds in the sky and spread out. It directly engulfed the entire civilized country, making all living beings in the civilized country feel the existence of this aura. Compared to Guai Shou's previous aura, this aura had an omnipotent, omniscient, and even eternal charm. At the same time, the range of the civilized country, or rather, the space-time protected by the 11 false saints, underwent a subtle change. A change that did not belong to this space-time, a characteristic that did not belong to this space, had unknowingly been added to this space-time. Immediately afterward, Guai Shou's figure slowly stepped out of his palace. At this moment, the wisdom in his eyes was more than 100 times stronger than before. As he stood there, it was as if the entire world was standing there. The mysterious aura around him was not something he could compare to in the past. At this moment, he raised his head and looked around. Countless mysterious lights and shadows appeared in his eyes. There seemed to be countless inexplicable mysteries flowing through his eyes. As for the 11 hidden false sages, they were all exposed in his eyes, and he could see through them directly. At this moment, the 11 false saints each sensed something and immediately came out of their respective cultivation places. They bowed to Guai Shou and said, "Congratulations to the Creator for becoming a saint." When Guai Shou heard this, The powerful aura that had originally spread across hundreds of millions of miles began to quickly retract. In the blink of an eye, he had already returned to his original appearance, and nothing special could be seen anymore. At the same time, the countless mysterious lights and shadows that had appeared in his eyes completely disappeared at this moment, as if they had never appeared in the first place. After that, he said, "I'm just walking the cultivation path that I've skipped in the past. What's there to be happy about?" As he said that, he did not wait for the false saints to speak and directly said, "I'm going to talk about the method of proving the Tao today. Those who are fated can come and listen." As he spoke, he casually patted the void. The space-time within hundreds of millions of miles naturally had waves of power transmitting. In the blink of an eye, an island was directly opened up in that strange existence above this normal space-time. The scenery was beautiful, and there were strange flowers and plants everywhere. There were all kinds of spiritual beasts overflowing with immortal chi everywhere. Everywhere was filled with the mysteries of true saint. The island was the truth of the great Tao. At first glance, this island did not seem too big, but no matter how many living beings entered it, it did not seem crowded at all. Just from this little change, it was already enough to tell. Gui Shou, who had reconfirmed his Tao and become a false saint, had improved a lot compared to before. In the past, although Gui Shou had gone through many cultivation sessions and had already raised his strength to a point where he could even condense a concept and could even be comparable to the living beings in the big organizations, second only to the strongest leader. However, he was definitely unable to control it so meticulously and easily. If it was the him back then, it would not have been difficult for him to create an island. However, if he wanted to place this island here at the right place and use his power to make this island have the various characteristics it had now, it would be a little difficult to do. Although he already knew that he had definitely improved a lot, when he really used his power and felt that feeling of being able to do as he pleased, that feeling of omnipotence, Gui Shou still felt an indescribable emotion. At this moment, he secretly blushed at his previous ignorance of the immensity of heaven and earth. In the past 1,000 years, through Luo Fan's hint, through the process of the 11 false saints becoming false saints, and through his own understanding and sensing of that inexplicable place, he finally walked the path of proving the Tao again and condensed his own foundation again. From then on, he finally broke through the limit and proved a realm that he had surpassed in the past, the false saint realm. After attaining this realm, he instantly felt that his connection with heaven and earth had suddenly been greatly strengthened. Although the various things in the world could originally be seen, they were separated by a layer of mystery. At this moment, they seemed so vivid and concrete in his eyes. It felt as if everything had become a part of his body, allowing him to control them according to his will. After all these emotions, he suddenly felt an indescribable sense of respect and gratitude towards his master, Luo Fan. Moreover, he felt indescribably fortunate that he directly acknowledged Luo Fan as his master after he was defeated by Luo Fan. If he had not admitted defeat so decisively back then, he would probably still be as muddle-headed as before. In fact, he might have already been killed by some unknown unforeseen event, just like the living beings that had occasionally been crushed and killed by this civilized country in the past 1,000 years. As he thought about it, he bowed to the hall where Luo Fan was from afar. Then, he turned around and took a light step, directly crossing the level of spacetime and entering the island he had created. Behind him, the 11 false saints also bowed to the hall where Luo Fan was. They were true false saints and had outstanding intelligence. Naturally, they knew who Gui Shou was bowing to and vaguely knew what he meant. How could they dare to be negligent? After bowing, they turned around and followed Gui Shou into the island that was higher than normal spacetime but lower than that inexplicable place. After entering this island, they truly felt the inexplicable shock in their eyes. This was because as soon as they entered this island, they could already feel that the inexplicable place that originally existed above their heads had become extremely clear. Chapter 1594. Fawn color equals red, squinting eyes face. Be due to the changes here, these false saints fell into an inexplicable state at this moment. For a moment, countless inspirations appeared, and countless sparks of wisdom continuously burst forth in their hearts. Under this inspiration and the sparks of wisdom, they felt that many of the problems they had encountered in the process of cultivation in the past had suddenly been solved. For a moment, they felt as if the world had become clear, and the world had become completely different from before. In the past 1,000 years, these false saints had been carefully consolidating their false saint realm, just like what Luo Fan had said back then. However, they had naturally broken through to the false saint realm because of the changes in the world. Compared to the false saints who had cultivated bit by bit, grown bit by bit, and crossed realms bit by bit, their understanding of cultivation and comprehension of the great Tao were somewhat insufficient. This kind of inadequacy was reflected in their cultivation. Even though they had greatly improved over the years, and even though they had grown quite a bit, it was still not enough for them to cultivate. However, such improvement and growth were not enough to completely solve the doubts that had appeared in their hearts at the same time. This way, in the short 1,000 years, if the problems they had accumulated were recorded in words, there would probably be hundreds of billions of words. In such a state, if they were to wait for them to impart the Tao of false saints to the entire civilized country, they would need to learn a lot of literature. FX. It would take tens of thousands of years for them to be able to do so. However, at this moment, Gui Shou had yet to begin to describe the Tao of false saints that he had comprehended over the years. However, they had already been stimulated by this island and were constantly receiving nourishment from that inexplicable place. They constantly felt that the cultivation problems that they had accumulated in the past were constantly being solved. Stop. At this moment, Gui Shou said calmly. Although this voice was ordinary, it directly penetrated all of their hearts and pulled all of them back from that inexplicable state, causing all of their eyes to suddenly reveal an inexplicable reluctance. There was actually an indescribable dissatisfaction in their eyes. One must know that just now, he felt that he had gained something at every moment. He felt that his cultivation realm was improving at every moment. The feeling that the problems that they had accumulated in the past were being solved was truly wonderful. But, at this moment, their Creator broke their state and woke them up from that indescribably wonderful feeling. To them, this was the first time their Creator had broken this state. It was as if he had been kicked down from the highest peak. That feeling was unbearable. It goes without saying. In fact, it could even be said that if it wasn't their Creator, Gui Shou, who did this, they would not be able to survive. If it was anyone else, no matter how strong that person was, they would definitely turn hostile at this moment and use their strongest attack towards the person who did this. How could he only show such dissatisfaction in his eyes? Gui Shou naturally knew what they were feeling, so he said indifferently, "Think about it again. What did you comprehend before?" These words were like a bucket of ice water being poured over their heads, causing the 11 false saints to feel the anger in their hearts suddenly extinguish and their minds clear up. They carefully recalled according to Gui Shou's guidance, and finally found that the answers to the cultivation problems they had encountered in that inexplicable place had completely disappeared at this time. It felt as if they had never found the answer. The problem was still the same, waiting for them to explore the answer. What's going on? At this moment, the 11 false saints could not help but exclaim. At this moment, how could they still be dissatisfied with Gui Shou? How could they still be reluctant to part with that feeling? There were even a few false saints who were filled with an indescribable sense of panic, feeling as if some huge conspiracy was being carried out. Gui Shou said indifferently, "It's impossible to bring out all the mysteries you have comprehended in that inexplicable place. Once you leave, all the principles you have comprehended in there will naturally disappear. Even I can't keep them. Therefore, it's just a waste of time for you to directly comprehend the principles in there." Hearing this, the false saints were shocked. The inexplicable place that they could originally sense but could not enter actually had such unbelievable mysteries. This was something they had never heard of or seen before. At this moment, when they heard Gui Shou mention it, they felt as if their horizons had been broadened. After the shock, the false saints all bowed to Gui Shou and repeatedly apologized, saying that they shouldn't have misunderstood Gui Shou's thoughts just now. Naturally, Gui Shou would not be stingy to such an extent. He only smiled faintly and slowly closed his eyes. Gui Shou was currently at the highest point of the island, on a platform. Below, the 11 false saints were on 11 praying mat. Behind the meditation cushions of the 11 false sages was a vast space. Here, it looked very ordinary, but every rise and fall of the ground and every line on it contained profound mysteries and unimaginable principles. It could be said that even if a living being came here and could not understand the principles that Gui Shou was talking about, just observing and memorizing these lines would be enough to obtain great benefits and allow their cultivation realm and great Tao to increase unbelievably. When this island was opened and Gui Shou and the 11 false saints entered the island to wait, the entire civilized country below was already in an uproar. Gui Shou's words that those who were fated could go and listen to the lecture spread throughout the entire civilized country. Although most of the living beings in this civilized country were born from the world, their templates were all connate Tao Constitution living beings created by Gui Shou. Even though they were born from the world, it did not change the connection between them and Gui Shou. When Gui Shou's words spread, all the living beings instantly understood who the person who spoke was. They instantly understood who the person who spoke was and knew how powerful the person who spoke was compared to them. For a moment, almost every living being who heard this voice had a strong desire to go and listen to the lecture. It's finally here. I want to go and listen to the lecture. In a certain deep mountain in the civilized country, a living being that looked like an old man said to his companion, a living being that looked like an old woman, "Listen to what? Don't you want your son anymore?" The old woman said angrily, "Children and grandchildren have their own blessings. Since he has gone out to adventure, it's already his own business. It's also his fate to encounter any danger," the old man said calmly. "What did you say?" The old woman looked at her old friend of hundreds of years in disbelief. She suddenly realized that she did not seem to know this person in front of her. The old man flicked his sleeves. He stood up and walked out of the cave abode in a seemingly slow but actually fast manner. Although the entire civilized country was insignificant compared to the entire world, to the point that it could even be ignored. However, it was still a distance of billions of miles. Within this range there were all kinds of terrains, mountains and plains, mountains and hills, grasslands and desert, rivers, lakes, and even oceans of various sizes existed here. Some of the living beings in the civilized country gathered together. They formed countries and lived like mortals, relying on the country to survive. Those who pursued cultivation, power, and immortality were like ordinary cultivators, setting up their own immortals' caves in the depths of the mountains and forests, cultivating day and night. Among them, there were even sects and legacies that occupied famous mountains and beautiful sceneries. Compared to other civilized countries, this one had a long history. Nowadays, the cultivation civilization here was many times more prosperous than in other places. As for the cultivation legacies and cultivation techniques, there were hundreds of schools of thought contending for supremacy. There were simply too many to count. The old man and the old woman were only independent cultivators, and the mountain they resided in was only an extremely ordinary mountain in this civilized country. Although it was quite wondrous, it was far inferior to the scenery of a true famous mountain. "Are you really so heartless?" the old woman shouted when she saw the old man walk out without any hesitation. "It's not that I'm heartless. It's just that we humans have the responsibility to strengthen our race. Compared to the rise and fall of the race, the personal feelings of a small family are insignificant," the old man said as he walked. "Good, good, good. Since you don't care, I will. This time, I will go and save the son of the Chi men," the old woman said angrily. "What's the point of you going? You should come with me to listen to the lecture." The old man turned around with an indescribable worry in his eyes. "Scram!" the old woman roared angrily. She turned around and walked past the old man, heading in a certain direction. "Why can't you understand?" The old man looked at the old woman's departing figure and sighed. He lifted his foot and walked in another direction. Whether it was fate or not depended on whether they knew where to go to listen to the lecture. The old man happened to be the fated one. He had a vague feeling about where to listen to the lecture. At this moment, he was heading in the direction he sensed. Similar things like the argument between the old man and the old woman were happening all over the world. Countless creatures resolutely abandoned everything and directly listened to the lecture based on the feeling in their hearts. There were also countless creatures who didn't want to leave what they were doing, so they threw the feeling in their hearts to the side and just went about their own business. These various changes caused countless tragedies and comedies to constantly evolve within a radius of hundreds of millions of miles in the entire civilized country. The creatures who followed the guidance of their hearts to listen to the lecture walked out of the normal space-time and entered the island created by Guai Shou. They arrived on the platform where Guai Shou and the false sages were. Of course, although they came here, their perspective was completely different from Guai Shou and the false sages. In their eyes, this was an empty plaza, and there was only an empty platform in front of the plaza. Apart from that, Guai Shou, false sages, and praying mats did not exist at all. These creatures. Some were strong, some were weak. The strong ones had even reached the level of a level 9 false sage. As for the weak ones, they had only cultivated dermic powers and barely achieved the immortal Tao. After these creatures came to this square, they naturally felt an indescribable shock. All the lights and shadows on this square, all the lines, and all the ups and downs brought indescribable emotions to their hearts. It made them naturally let go of all the competitive thoughts and directly picked a corner to sit down. They began to carefully comprehend the many bullies, the changes of many lines. As time passed, the number of creatures that came from all over increased. 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1,000,000 a few days later. The number of creatures that came to listen to the lecture had already exceeded 100 billion, and these 100 billion creatures were distributed in this square that didn't seem very wide. However, the square didn't seem crowded at all, nor was there any worry of being unable to accommodate them. The entire square was so mysterious. Looking closely at every creature, there was quite a bit of space around them that allowed them to move freely. However, on the whole, this square, which could only accommodate hundreds of creatures at most, had now been stuffed with 100 billion creatures. This mysterious change made the creatures in the square look forward to what they could obtain from this lecture. Just this square alone was already so mysterious and unbelievable. How mysterious would the true principles of the lecture be? Among these 100 billion creatures, almost all of them had extremely firm Tao hearts. Not every living being could be as resolute as the old man in abandoning his wife. However, these living beings were all extremely determined in their goals. They wanted to reach the end of their cultivation path even more urgently than other living beings, wanted to reach a higher realm of cultivation. After waiting for 9 days, when no more creatures came from the civilized country, Guai Shou casually waved his hand and directly cut off the connection between this island and normal space-time. This made this island truly become a completely independent island, causing all living beings to instantly lose their senses of this island. After that, Guai Shou directly changed the perspective of all living beings, causing Gui Shou and the 11 false sages to appear in the eyes of the hundreds of billions of living beings. Greetings, Creator. Greetings, Sage. In an instant, the hundreds of billions of living beings hurriedly stood up and bowed. The scene of hundreds of people bowing was already extremely shocking. It went without saying how shocking it was for hundreds of billions of people to bow at the same time. At this moment, the sound wave even broke through the island, broke through this strange existence, and directly crashed into the civilized country. It was like a thunderclap that reverberated above the entire civilized country. For a moment, countless living beings looked at the void in shock. Among them, the living beings who could originally sense the guidance but had given up on this guidance felt a little regretful. Are you regretting it? In a certain city, a woman was very unhappy and said to the disappointed man beside her. When the man heard this, he came back to his senses and said, "How can that be? I don't know how long it will take to listen to the lecture this time. I can't stand not being with you during this period of time." "Humph. I think you're regretting it," the woman said relentlessly. No, yes. You must be blaming me. Blame me for not letting you go because I can't go to listen to the lecture. Isn't that right?" the woman shouted. There was a flash of bitterness in the man's eyes, but he still tried to coax the woman. It was only after a long while that the woman finally broke into a smile. However, the man vaguely felt that he had probably lost a huge opportunity. "I hope I won't regret my choice today in the future," he thought to himself. He suddenly noticed the woman beside him, who seemed unruly but had a faint uneasiness in the depths of her eyes. All kinds of thoughts were instantly abandoned and replaced with a heart full of tenderness. No matter what, this is my decision. For her. So what if I give up this opportunity? He instantly made up his mind. The two of them were a pair of cultivation companions, and their respective cultivation bases were already extremely profound. When they heard the voice transmission of the lecture, they planned to go and listen to the lecture at the same time. However, after they set off, he discovered that only the man could sense where the lecture was, but the woman couldn't sense it at all. Moreover, even if they set off at the same time, the man and the woman would eventually get separated without them knowing. The man continued to head toward the lecture, while the woman could only stay in normal spacetime. After experimenting dozens of times, they were finally convinced that this woman was the fated person. And this man was the fated person after that. Naturally, he was conflicted. One had to know that the dangers of this world were beyond imagination. Although there were 11 false saints suppressing this civilized country, and it was much safer than the outside world. However, after all, it was impossible to change the nature of the world. Who knew when the environment of the world would change slightly? It was already enough to cause the living beings in this civilized country to suffer a calamity. Such things were really not rare in the past 1,000 years. And, obviously, going to listen to the Creator's lecture was a process that took an unknown amount of time. Perhaps by the time he returned, thousands or even tens of thousands of years would have passed. In that case, if the man left the woman here and went to listen to the lecture, he might be separated by life and death by the time he returned. In other words, if he made the decision to go and listen to the lecture, he had to be prepared to be separated by life and death. How could a pair of extremely loving Tao companions not be conflicted? In the end, their final decision was obviously like this. The man gave up on the opportunity to listen to the lecture and stayed here to accompany the woman. In fact, this kind of thing was not uncommon in this civilized country. Some were Tao companions, and one of them could sense it. Some were father and son, some were mother and daughter, and some were even good friends. Because of these inexplicable ties, many living beings gave up on the opportunity to listen to the lecture and stayed in this civilized country to accompany their friends and family. This was also the reason why most living beings in this civilized country gave up on the opportunity to listen to the lecture. At this moment, under the majestic voice that even penetrated the barrier between normal spacetime and that strange existence, countless living beings suddenly felt regretful. They vaguely felt that they had lost an important opportunity. Gui Shou, who was on this island, naturally did not care about the thoughts of the living beings. He was not joking when he said that they could listen to the lecture if they were fated. The way he guided the living beings to listen to the lecture was not according to any rules. Instead, he guided them randomly according to their cultivation. As for what kind of living beings would receive the opportunity and what kind of living beings would come to listen to the lecture, it was all up to the heavens. In other words, whether or not the living beings who came to listen to the lecture would be decided by the heavens. However, he was not the one who ordered it. Under such circumstances, how could he care about what kind of living being would come here and what kind of living being would give up on the opportunity? After everyone bowed, he did not waste any time and directly explained the various cultivation techniques that he had comprehended in the past 1,000 years, including the method to verify his Tao and become a false sage. He went from simple to deep, explaining everything in detail. As he was preaching such a supreme principle, every word that he uttered turned into Tao sounds that caused the endless mysteries on the island to vibrate continuously. This caused the endless mysteries of the true sage on the island to vibrate continuously and evolve continuously. As this happened, the light around the square gradually changed. It evolved into the void of the universe, the various states of the human world and countless world. It also displayed the truth that Gui Shou was talking about in the beginning, because the truth that Gui Shou was talking about was not profound. Almost all living beings could understand it. However, as time passed and the truth he was talking about became more and more profound, the number of living beings that could understand it decreased. As a result, more and more living beings gradually fell into a daze as they listened to the lecture and gradually lost all perception of the outside world. Of course, whether they could understand or not, they would be able to obtain great benefits by coming here to listen. Chapter 1595. Fawn color equals red, squinting eyes face. B. This lecture lasted for 3,000 years. From the most basic method of guiding qi into the body to proving the Tao and becoming a false saint, he even talked about how to cultivate and improve in this world after becoming a false saint. Such a lecture was a great opportunity for every one of the billions of living beings listening to the lecture. During this process, every single living being obtained great benefit. Ordinary cultivators, needless to say, had their horizons broadened, allowing them to peak at a path from zero all the way to the peak of cultivation, to eternal immortality, and to a path that could not be worn down by 1,000 tribulations. Even for the 11 false saints, they had gained a lot of benefits during this process. Although these false saints had already cultivated for a long time before the living beings in this civilized country had completely become the protagonists of this world. However, their cultivation was sorted out by themselves after all. They had comprehended it bit by bit from zero. If there were any detours, improper bends, omissions or mistakes, it was not something worth being surprised at all. Therefore, it could be said that although these false saints had improved step by step since they started cultivating, their understanding of cultivation was still extremely shallow. Not only did they not know the Tao of false saints, but they also did not know how to cultivate to become a false saint and how to improve after becoming a false saint. Even the entire cultivation process before that was still unclear. And now, in these 3,000 years, the entire Tao lecture process of Gui Shou had made up for this entire process for them. After all, although Gui Shou was not a living being who had cultivated step by step from zero to where he was now, the height he was standing at was already much higher than that of a false saint. Moreover, he had also gone through the process of proving the Tao and becoming a false saint before this. His understanding of the entire cultivation process was naturally not something that those false saints could compare to. Even compared to an existence like Luo Fan, who had exhausted the essence of cultivation, there was still a huge gap. However, he crushed all the living beings listening to the lecture. There was absolutely no problem. Moreover, because these living beings were created by him, everything about them came from him. His own understanding of cultivation. Regardless of whether there were any mistakes or omissions, it was the most suitable for these creatures. It could be said that he was second only to Luo Fan, who had exhausted the essence of cultivation. 3,000 years passed in the blink of an eye for the billions of living beings who were listening. Even after Guai Shou finished his lecture, they were still unsatisfied and wanted Guai Shou to continue. However, this period of time had changed the entire civilized country below. But it was practically earth-shattering. For those who didn't listen to the Tao, this was already a long enough period of time, enough for their entire living conditions to change drastically. Right now, if these creatures were to return to the civilized country, they would definitely find that everything that they were familiar with in the past had disappeared. For example, the old woman who had fallen out with the old man had long since disappeared. For example, the others who had abandoned their Tao companions would probably discover it when they returned to a civilized country. Their Tao companions had already become Tao companions with others. These various changes would obviously have an incomparably huge impact on the hearts of many living beings, but it was enough to make many living beings have a new understanding of the Tao lecture this time. Perhaps some living beings would regret because of this, or perhaps some living beings would rejoice and be happy because of this. However, Guai Shou didn't care about these at all. At this moment, Guai Shou was extremely satisfied with the achievements of this Tao lecture. This was because during the process of lecturing, he had already discovered that there were more than 100,000 living beings who had the potential to become false saints. The probability of finding more than 100,000 living beings out of 100 billion living beings was really extremely low. However, compared to the many living beings who were groping around in a daze, this probability had already increased by more than 1,000 times. Normally speaking, without Guai Shou's lecture, being able to find 10 living beings out of 100 billion living beings who could become false saints was already considered to have received too much favor from the heavens and earth. They were the main characters among the main characters of the world. How could they find more than 100,000 living beings? After the lecture ended, Guai Shou casually said, "This lecture has ended. Apart from the people I've selected, everyone else can leave." Hearing this, the many living beings woke up from their state of enlightenment. They bowed to Guai Shou and shouted, "Thank you, Creator, for teaching us the Tao." After that, without waiting for them to do anything, Guai Shou waved his hand, and they all disappeared from the island. All of them returned to where they were before they entered the island, and they also scattered across the entire civilized nation. Although this civilized country had nearly doubled in size in the past 3,000 years, they could no longer spread across the entire civilized country when they scattered. Instead, they only spread out in half of the central region of the civilized country. After the many living beings disappeared, only the living beings with the potential to become sages that Guai Shou had chosen were left on the platform of the island. All of you have the potential to become sages. What the Guai Shou said made the over 100,000 living beings, who were still bewildered reveal expressions of disbelief. To them, who already understood what a false saint was and how terrifying its power was, becoming a false saint was a great achievement. Every one of them knew very well how great it was. Every single one of them had countless expectations about whether they could become a false saint. However, that was just a vision, just a premonition. None of them were certain that they could become a false saint after knowing how difficult it was to become a false saint. Under such circumstances, suddenly hearing the Creator in front of them directly tell them that they had the possibility of becoming a false saint, it was obvious what kind of surprise it was. However, although it was a surprise, they were all cultivators with profound cultivation after all. They did not make any noise because of this. At this moment, every single one of them maintained their composure, and not a single one of them made any noise. Seeing this, Gui Shou was not surprised. He said, "Previously, when I talked about the Tao of false saints, it was just a rough introduction. If you want to rely on it to become a false saint, you still don't have enough strength. Next, I will tell you the true key to becoming a false saint." As he said that, without waiting for the many living beings to react, he directly started to talk about his own comprehension. This time around, the words that came out of his mouth no longer had any substance. There was no concrete language. It was just a series of Tao sounds that shook the void and the world. The Tao sounds that shook the mysteries of true saints, the fragments of great Tao, and even the life essence of every living being here. Under this Tao sound, every living being felt that they had directly fallen into an indescribable state. In a daze, they seemed to feel that they seemed to have obtained an indescribably huge harvest. However, after thinking about it, it seemed like they had obtained nothing in this process. They had unknowingly completely lost all perception of the outside world. When they came back to their senses from this dazed state, Yi Zichen's eyes lit up. It was already 10,000 years later. When they came back to their senses, there were waves of enlightenment in their eyes. There seemed to be countless rays of wisdom shining faintly. They seemed to have understood something, but they also didn't seem to understand anything. Only the changes in the perception of heaven and earth, the mysteries of true saints, and even the perception of the great Tao fragments reminded them that they were already completely different from 10,000 years ago. Gui Shou looked down at the hundreds of thousands of living beings, but he felt a little tired. In the past 10,000 years, although he said that he was specifically talking about the key to becoming a false saint, in fact, he had directly used his own cultivation realm and life essence to resonate with all living beings, the world, the mysteries of true saints, and the great Tao fragment. Through this resonance, he imparted his understanding of cultivation and his understanding of the false saint to the many living beings, allowing each of them to engrave the various states of the false saint into the depths of their life instincts. Thus, they would be able to clear the obstacles to becoming a false saint, allowing as many living beings as possible to truly break through the barrier between the false saint and become a false saint. This method was actually developed from a technique that Luo Fan had imparted to him back then. Or rather, it was developed from the technique that Luo Fan had originally prepared for Qing Yi and Yu Ji when he asked Luo Fan to come over. Judging from the performance of these living beings at this moment, his method of preaching the Tao was obviously very effective. At this moment, among the many living beings, the auras of the dozens of living beings near the front suddenly began to churn. Are they going to break through? When Gui Shou saw this, he could not help but smile inexplicably. Although Gui Shou did not set any rules, because of the unwritten rule, the stronger the living being, the closer they were to the front. In other words, the closer they were to the platform Gui Shou was on. The living beings whose auras were changing in front of him were all level 9 pseudo-saints. And if they broke through from level 9 pseudo-saints, they would obviously be false saints. After discovering this, Gui Shou casually waved his hand, and the island sank slightly. It directly broke through the strange existence and descended into normal space-time. It appeared directly above the civilized country, close to the most central mountain peak. The moment they arrived, the changes in the bodies of the dozen or so living beings seemed to suddenly explode, and they began to increase crazily. Powerful and unparalleled auras began to be emitted from their bodies continuously. This aura spread endlessly and began to quickly cover the void within a radius of billions of miles of the entire civilized country. It directly made every living being feel this vast and supreme aura that did not cause them any harm. Under this aura, all the living beings involuntarily knelt in the direction of the island. Following this change, above the void there was naturally a multicolored light circulating. This multicolored light spread throughout the void within the entire civilized country. It made the entire sky of the civilized country seem to have turned into beautiful jade. It looked so mysterious and beautiful in this multicolored light. There was a faint sound of joyful thunder. Amidst this sound, wisps of strange fragrance appeared out of thin air and lingered in the entire civilized country. Amidst this strange fragrance, there were also all kinds of inexplicable notes falling. This kind of note. It was somewhat similar to the Tao voice that came out of Gui Shou's mouth, and shook all the living beings who heard it. However, it was deeper and more profound. The impact it had caused was even greater. Almost all the living beings felt their souls being cleansed at this moment. They all felt that their souls were being cleansed, and they all discovered that all kinds of inexplicable information flashed through their minds. During this process, the auras of the dozen or so living beings that had caused all kinds of changes began to rapidly increase. There seemed to be endless information in the void, and as it continuously surged into their bodies, it pushed their cultivation realm and began to continuously increase. The bodies of these creatures began to rise higher and higher as they gradually left the island. Moreover, their bodies began to gradually turn into nothingness during this process, as if they had gradually integrated into the world. Time. At this moment, it seemed to have lost all meaning. Everyone forgot the passage of time at this moment. After an unknown period of time, all the changes calmed down. The dozen or so living beings that had completely disappeared into the void trembled and reappeared in the void. However, compared to when they had disappeared, these dozen or so living beings already had a kind of eternal indestructibility on them. They were indestructible and omniscient. They were omniscient and omnipotent. The deep wisdom flickering in their eyes was not much inferior to that of the 11 false saints from before. Obviously, at this moment, these dozen or so cultivators had already successfully broken through the false saint stage, becoming true false saints. The achievements of these dozen or so cultivators instantly made the living beings who were listening to the Tao reveal an inexplicable complicated expression. Among these complicated expressions, there was envy for those dozen or so living beings, as well as inexplicable anticipation for themselves to eventually become false saints. They were all able to become false saints just by listening to the Tao, and they were not much inferior to them. They were also people who were praised by the Creator to be able to become false saints, so they should not be much inferior to them. The dozen or so false saints naturally did not care about these living beings. After becoming false saints, they did not comprehend the difference between false saints and level 9 false saint. They directly looked at each other and took light steps forward. They arrived on the platform and came before Gui Shou. They bowed to Gui Shou and thanked him for imparting the technique to them. However, Gui Shou smiled faintly and said, "In this world, apart from here, there are still countless others of your kind. You guys have become false saints first, but you have to bear the responsibility of protecting them. If you have the heart, you can go and protect them if you have the chance in the future." Hearing this, not only the dozen or so false saints, but even the 11 false saints who had become false saints before also agreed. Gui Shou nodded and waved his hand. In an instant, all the living beings on this island disappeared completely, and they were sent back to the position before they entered the island. Even the 20-odd false saints had been swept out of the island by him at this moment. After that, he lifted his foot and lightly stomped on the ground. The island instantly crumbled into countless fragments, which looked like countless tiny light spots that scattered in all directions. After a while, they disappeared without a trace, as if they were never there in the first place. As for him, he took a step forward and directly arrived in front of the hall where Luo Fan was and stepped into it. "Master, I've already finished preaching the method to become a false saint. I've opened up the path for all living beings in this country to become false saints." After arriving here, Gui Shou was no longer as unfathomable as he was in front of other living beings. Instead, he seemed extremely humble as he bowed to Luo Fan above. After a while, Luo Fan's body, which was cultivating with his eyes closed, gradually broke away from the illusory state. He slowly opened his eyes. Over the years, Luo Fan had been cultivating wholeheartedly and did not care about what was happening in the outside world. At this moment, compared to before, his cultivation realm had already improved greatly. Although it was not completely compatible with the perfection of his world of laws, the gap between them was not too far. It could be said that with his current cultivation realm, he could easily crush himself from more than 10,000 years ago. After opening his eyes, his heart skipped a beat. In the past 10,000 years, he had already clearly understood everything that had happened in the entire civilized country. Naturally, he knew exactly what Guizhou had been doing for the past 10,000 years. At this moment, he nodded and said, "Well done." However, the country outside has already fallen into an abyss of suffering. Have you not noticed? Guizhou's heart trembled. His heart shuddered, and he instantly felt an indescribable pressure coming from the void, acting on his life source. This pressure was not from Luo Fan, but an inexplicable feeling, or rather, an inexplicable premonition. This premonition, this feeling, was not something else. It was precisely because he suddenly sensed that something that was closely related to him was happening in an extremely distant place. He felt such a pressure. Guizhou's expression changed and he said, "I only felt it now." Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "This is the change of the world. Now, it has been more than 10,000 years since the world has determined the protagonist, but you have not done anything too active. This is the blessing of the world. It is already gradually dispersing. That is why your senses are not as clear as before." "What should I do? Master, please teach me." Guizhou heard this. His expression changed greatly. It should be known that his fate was now completely linked to the creatures with born Taoism aptitude in this civilized country. Under such circumstances, if the world's blessing for them shifted, it obviously meant that the world's blessing for him had also shifted. It was easy to imagine how great a loss it would be for him. How could he not care after understanding this? Go, leave this place. Search for those countries in the world and help them. With your current strength, you can deal with those creatures that will attack you, but those that you can't will not attack you. You already have enough power to protect yourself, Luo Fan said faintly. This was what he had comprehended after his cultivation level had increased. The identity of the world's protagonist was very important to the ordinary creatures in this world. It was enough to affect their safety and their living conditions. Therefore, those creatures must be extremely hostile to the creatures that replace them as the world's protagonist. They must be thinking of ways to get rid of these creatures at all times. However, for those who were truly powerful, such as those who could suppress Luo Fan with a trace of their will and easily rescue the creatures from the big organizations, the identity of the world's protagonist was nothing to them. To them, whether they were the world's protagonist or not, or even whether they existed in this world, was already secondary. Their bodies were already strong enough to resist the heavens and earth. Under such circumstances, they naturally did not care about the new world's protagonist. In other words, as long as they did not provoke them, they could not be bothered. It was because he understood this that Luo Fan would say such words at this time. Hearing Luo Fan's words, Guizhou's eyes lit up, and he hurriedly said, "Yes." Luo Fan nodded his head. With a thought, he casually made a grabbing motion with his hand. The living beings that he had enlightened on this mountain peak were all caught by him in a daze and brought into the palace. There were thousands of these creatures, and every one of them was different in size. There were countless of them that were tens of thousands of feet tall and hundreds of thousands of feet tall. However, with so many creatures crammed into this not-so-big hall, it did not seem crowded at all. However, this palace hall easily accommodated all of them. Chapter 1596. Fawn color equals red, squinting eyes face. Luo Fan looked at the strange creatures and said plainly, Now that the world has changed, there's no benefit for you to stay here. Now, follow Gui Shou and earn merits for the new protagonist of this world." These creatures heard every single word he said clearly and understood the meaning behind it. However, when all the words were put together, the creatures couldn't understand what he meant at all. For a time, all of the living beings revealed expressions of confusion and bewilderment. However, Luo Fan's omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient attitude had given them great confidence, making them understand that listening to Luo Fan was the right choice. Therefore, all the creatures knelt and thanked Luo Fan for arranging a way out for them. Then, they turned around to greet Gui Shou. Gui Shou looked at them and was overjoyed in his heart. It turned out that if he was alone, there were so many countries in this world that he had to visit. Obviously, he was too busy. Now that he had the help of these living beings, he could naturally relax a lot. Then, he solemnly told the creatures to dispense with the formalities and turned around to thank Luo Fan. Luo Fan nodded slightly and waved his hand to let them leave the hall to do what they needed to do. The arrangement he made with those living beings was not simply to provide some helpers for the longevity turtle. In fact, what he told those living beings was not a lie. Now, the protagonist of this world had changed. Although it didn't seem like there was any earth-shattering change in this world, the situation of this world had changed. However, the situation of the world had changed. It was no longer the same as before. This was something that was certain. In the past, these living beings were the main characters of the world. In this world, they were the main characters. In this world, they still enjoyed the blessings of the heavens. Therefore, no matter what they did, they would only develop better and better. But now, the situation was different. Because of the change of this world, the blessings of the heavens that they enjoyed had disappeared. If they still lived like before, the outcome would only get worse and worse. If they continued to live like before, then the outcome would only get worse and worse. In the end, it was even possible that he would directly die a violent death and disappear without a trace in a certain upheaval. If they wanted to change this outcome, there was only one way, and that was to change their current methods. Changing his current practice of quietly cultivating on this mountain peak was the best choice. Naturally, it was to attach itself to the new protagonist of this world, and then use indirect methods to enjoy the blessings of this world. It was obvious that it wanted to attach itself to the new main character of this world. The best way was, of course, for the new protagonist to create merit and help the new protagonist gain a foothold in this changed world, helping them develop in this world. It was because of this consideration that he directly let these creatures follow Gui Shou out of this civilized country and let them help Gui Shou. Luo Fan had already spoken. Gui Shou and the others naturally couldn't stay here any longer. After they saluted, they turned around and left the hall. After they left the hall, Gui Shou did not hesitate. He directly led these creatures to soar into the sky and rush toward the nearest civilized country that he could faintly sense. That civilized country was hundreds of millions of miles away from this civilized country. In the process of rushing toward that location, they quickly left the range of this civilized country. The moment they crossed that boundary, they felt an inexplicable feeling. Gui Shou felt that the surroundings had become thousands of times more dangerous. An inexplicable malice was born from nothingness, directly oppressing him, as if it was ready to erase him at any time. The other creatures felt even more obvious. Even their bodies directly began to tremble, as if they felt that their lives would be completely lost in the next moment. Enemies! At this moment, this thought flashed in Gui Shou's mind. At this moment, a figure with 9 heads and 13 arms appeared in front of Gui Shou and the others. Gui Shou was very familiar with this figure. It was one of the many creatures that had fought against Luo Fan. Yes, they have been guarding here, waiting for us to leave. In an instant, this thought appeared in Gui Shou's mind. They finally came out. They made me wait for so many years. The 9-headed, 13-armed creature said. As it spoke, it suddenly attracted an inexplicable and powerful power from an inexplicable place. After this power descended into the normal spacetime, it began to change rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it had already turned into an absolutely pure sealing concept, completely sealing the spacetime within an unknown radius of tens of thousands of miles. At this moment, Gui Shou felt as if his body had been completely locked by this sealing concept, as if he could not move at all. As for the other creatures, even their own thoughts and intelligence had been completely sealed by this sealing concept. Everything was maintained at the instant when the 9-headed, 13-armed creature had just used this method. Sensing these changes, Gui Shou suddenly showed a smile. In the past, I was just an ant in your eyes. But now, as he spoke, an indescribable concept suddenly burst out from his body. This concept was also formed by that inexplicable power. Moreover, compared to the surrounding sealing concept, this concept was even more valiant and resolute. In an instant, it had completely turned the surrounding sealing concept into a concept of nothingness. Next, endless power descended from the void and directly integrated into the concept of nothingness that was released from his body. This directly strengthened the concept of nothingness by countless times and directly constructed a concept of nothingness cage. In turn, it trapped the 9-headed, 13-armed creature in front of him. How is this possible? At this moment, the 9-headed, 13-armed creature could not help but exclaim. Seeing the method that Gui Shou had used, he could not help but think of Luo Fan back then. The concept of nothingness that Gui Shou had used now was too similar to the concept of nothingness that Luo Fan had used back then. Not only were the concepts similar, moreover, the intensity and scale were also extremely similar. This made him suddenly have an inexplicable illusion that he was not facing a creature like Gui Shou, who he had completely looked down upon and regarded as an ant. Instead, he was facing hundreds of creatures alone. Luo Fan, who was so powerful that he made people feel hopeless. At this moment, the intense humiliation that he had felt when he was suppressed back then emerged in his heart. This humiliation. Soon, it turned into boundless anger. The raging flames gushed out of its body, allowing it to transform the concept of seal around its body into the concept of absolute destruction. This concept of destruction collided with the concept of nothingness cage that Gui Shou had used, causing an earth-shattering reaction. That was spacetime. The mysteries of the true sage, the fragments of the great Tao, and all other forces collapsed inch by inch in this earth-shattering reaction. A sound that seemed to be the complete collapse of the whole world was produced from the point of collision and began to flow in all directions. It directly shook the civilized country not far away. At the same time, figures that were originally hidden in all directions appeared because of this vibration. These creatures. They were all the creatures that had been defeated by Luo Fan. Of course, they were only a part of them. Not all the creatures that had been defeated and suppressed by Luo Fan were guarding here. Most of them did not guard here. Instead, they left this place and returned to their respective places of cultivation. At this moment, those creatures that had appeared were all looking at this place with fiery eyes. Some of them were even rubbing their palms. It seemed that they could not wait to pounce on Gui Shou and tear him into pieces. The result of the collision was not that one of them was suppressing the other. Instead, they were equally matched. Gui Shou's concept of nothingness did not completely shatter because of this collision. It was completely destroyed. The concept of destruction that the 9-headed, 13-armed creature had sent out did not completely disappear because of this. During this collision, these two concepts just turned into countless fragments that splashed in all directions. However, facing such a result, both of them had different reactions. Gui Shou showed a satisfied smile, while the 9-headed, 13-armed creature only had shock and disbelief on its face. The reason for this was very simple. Don't forget that tens of thousands of years ago, when Luo Fan fought against this 9-headed, 13-armed creature, although Gui Shou was also a native creature born with innate wisdom, his strength was many times worse than this 9-headed, 13-armed creature. It could be said that if the 9-headed, 13-armed creature wanted to deal with Gui Shou, it did not even need to do it personally. It only needed to casually release a bit of its power, and it would be enough to make Gui Shou die without a burial place. However, at this moment, Gui Shou relied on his own strength and the inexplicable power that he grasped to fight the 9-headed, 13-armed creature in front of him to a standstill. The 9-headed, 13-armed creature could not even hurt those living beings that he wanted to protect. How could Gui Shou not be satisfied with such a huge improvement in just over 10,000 years? The 9-headed, 13-armed creature was in disbelief for the same reason as Gui Shou. It was also because it could easily destroy Gui Shou in the past, but now it could no longer do so. You've made such a huge improvement? At this moment a voice was heard. Then, a huge figure broke through the void and directly appeared here. This figure had the appearance of a long snake. Moreover, it was a long snake with 2 heads and fish scales on its body. Its body was hundreds of thousands of meters long, and its appearance almost covered half of the sky. At this moment, it was one of its heads that spoke. As it spoke, it had already guided the power from that inexplicable place, and began to transform in the void. In the end, it turned into a soft concept that pressed down on Gui Shou. "I don't need you!" The 9-headed, 13-armed creature suddenly roared at this moment. Following this roar, it actually did not care about anything else. It actually didn't care and directly condensed the concept of destruction that had just been scattered, and directly blasted it towards the concept of softness. The moment the two collided, the collision produced a movement that was no less than the previous collision between Gui Shou's concept of nothingness and the destroyed concept, directly causing the void to shake violently. The 2-headed snake was enraged and said, "What are you doing?" At this moment, it had already stopped spreading the concept of softness and placed it around its body. It was constantly wriggling and changing. Although this soft concept didn't seem to have any power just from its name, it could completely change the nature of everything. Could change it into a soft concept. Whether it was the true divine occult or the great path fragment. Whether it was a living creature or something else. If such a concept really broke through the defense and was used on Gui Shou, then Gui Shou's body would definitely collapse completely at the first moment. Everything that existed on his body would directly turn into a soft concept, causing him to almost die and his soul to scatter. "He's mine." The 9-headed, 13-armed creature roared again. However, compared to the 2-headed snake, which only wrapped its soft concept around its body to prepare to fight against its enemy, it displayed a stronger offensive ability. The destroyed concept was far away at this moment, as if it was ready to pounce at any moment and fight to the death with the 2-headed snake. "You can't deal with him at all." Seeing its various performances, the 2-headed snake was even more furious. It roared. "I haven't used my strength yet," the 9-headed, 13-armed creature said coldly. "You guys chat, I'll leave first." Gui Shou saw this opportunity and said with a smile. As he spoke, the concept of nothingness around him trembled slightly. He instantly broke through the concept of destruction that had weakened because he had to guard against the twin-headed snake's concept of softness. Then, he quickly ran away from the civilized country. "Damn it!" The 9-headed, 13-armed creature turned pale with fright at this moment. At this moment, it couldn't care less about the 2-headed snake. It directly changed the direction of its destroyed concept and blasted all of it towards the concept of nothingness around Gui Shou's body. However, unfortunately, for an existence like Gui Shou, it simply had no problem at all to travel hundreds of millions of kilometers in an instant. Even though the 9-headed, 13-armed being was only a split second slower, Gui Shou had already led the beings behind him and traveled hundreds of millions of kilometers away from this place. It's all your fault. The two-headed snake shouted angrily at this moment. While speaking, it also blasted its softness concept towards Guai Shou. It wanted to stop Guai Shou. I haven't said it's your fault yet. The 9-headed, 13-armed creature was even more furious than the two-headed snake. Although Guai Shou had already flown hundreds of millions of kilometers away, after all, the attacks of those creatures could also cross such a long distance. Therefore, in the end, he still suffered the bombardment of these two concepts. With a loud bang, he shot off into the distance with the many living beings at an even faster speed. The bombardment of the two concepts on the concept of nothingness around him didn't stop him from moving forward quickly. Instead, it provided him with a strong thrust, causing his body to speed up continuously during this process, even surpassing his limit as he flew into the distance. Damn it! What have you done? At this moment, the other creatures who were guarding and preparing to deal with Guai Shou couldn't help but shout. At this moment, they were all hurriedly attacking Guai Shou. They kept bombarding him with all kinds of concepts, trying to stop him. However, Guai Shou's speed was really too fast. In a flash, he had already exceeded their attack range, making their attacks completely miss. When Guai Shou's figure completely disappeared, they looked at each other in dismay as they watched Guai Shou's disappearing figure. At this time, if they wanted to deal with Guai Shou, there was only one way, which was to follow the direction in which Guai Shou left, find out his destination, and find the most important place where he stayed. All of the living beings here were well aware of this. However, even though they knew this, none of them stood up to chase after him. Even the 9-headed and 13-armed creature and the 2-headed snake that were fooled by Guai Shou didn't do anything. The reason for this? The reason was not complicated. For them, Guai Shou was just a small fry. What they cared about most was Luo Fan and this civilized country. If they had a chance to kill Guai Shou, who was obviously on Luo Fan's side, they naturally wouldn't let him go. However, if they had to choose an enemy between Guai Shou and Luo Fan, they would choose an opponent. Obviously, it would only be Luo Fan. And obviously, if they chased after Guai Shou now, they would give up on Luo Fan and choose Guai Shou. Under such circumstances, it would be strange if they chased after Guai Shou. If you hadn't interfered, I would have kept him here, the 9-headed and 13-armed creature said lightly. Humph. You can't deal with him by yourself. Everyone knows this. I was the most suitable person to attack just now. If you hadn't stopped me, how could this have happened? How could the 2-headed snake admit such a thing? It shouted angrily. It's because of you too. At this time, the angry voices of the creatures in the distance came. What? Do you want to beat me? The 2-headed snake said furiously. The 9-headed and 13-armed creature also looked angrily at the creatures who spoke. Seeing that the two creatures didn't have the slightest intention of repentance, the creatures were all enraged. Immediately, waves of concepts were cast toward the two creatures from all directions. The two creatures roared angrily. With great tacit understanding, they combined the concepts that they had condensed with the help of that inexplicable power and blasted them at the incoming waves. Boom, 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 an earth-shattering tremor exploded at this moment. The entire civilized country trembled slightly at this moment. However, this tremor was similar to the previous tremors. It was also the tremor of the entire civilized country. It didn't really cause any damage to the interior of the entire civilized country, nor did it cause any damage to the creatures in the entire civilized country. After all, the entire civilized country was protected by many false saints. Now, the various factors had already condensed into one. It was unbreakable at this moment. In the palace at the top of the mountain in the center of the civilized country, Luo Fan stopped the suppression concept that he had prepared. This thought flashed through his mind. It seems that Guai Shou has left safely. When he asked Guai Shou to leave this civilized country, He had already considered the creatures who were waiting outside, waiting for an opportunity to destroy this civilized country and kill him. At first, he didn't think that Guizhou could break through their blockade alone, escape safely, and head to other civilized countries. His original plan was to directly use the suppression concept here, when Guizhou couldn't take it anymore, and suppress all the creatures for a period of time, allowing Guizhou to escape safely. He naturally didn't have the ability to use the suppression concept alone to suppress all the creatures. However, after more than 10,000 years of cultivation, his cultivation realm had improved greatly, and his ability to use concepts was also many times stronger than before. Now, he had absolute confidence that he could do this, although even if he did it, he would only be able to suppress all of them for a few days at most. This period of time should be enough for Guizhou to escape to the ends of the world. It was precisely because he had already considered everything that he dared to let Guizhou leave directly. Otherwise, why would he send Guizhou to his death so casually? However, Luo Fan didn't expect that not only had Guizhou's strength improved so much, but his intelligence had also improved so much. In the process, he didn't need his help at all. He had already escaped with the help of the conflicts between the creatures, which made him look at him in a new light. Chapter 1597. The Guizhou and the other creatures fled from the encirclement in a panic like stray dogs. In fact, he knew very well that his master, Luo Fan, must have made all kinds of preparations to allow them to escape safely. However, he did not regard this as something to rely on. Instead, he directly ignored all of Luo Fan's support and wholeheartedly tried his best to escape the encirclement. After all, even if Luo Fan protected him, it was obvious that he could not be his babysitter forever. If he did not seize the opportunity to temper himself and improve his strength, what would he do next time he encountered such a situation? It was precisely because of these considerations that he had used this method of using his opponent's attack to escape. As a result, he felt waves of sharp pain all over his body at this moment. Whether it was his power or his life essence, even his connection with that inexplicable place, they were all greatly affected. Even his strength was much weaker than when he was at his peak. Even so, he did not dare to be negligent. Instead, he quickly sped up and headed toward the location that he had sensed inexplicably. It was the location of the other civilized country that belonged to the creature with the innate Taoism aptitude. This civilized country was thousands of light years away from the one where Luo Fan was. Even Guizhou had spent a few days to bring the many living beings to this location. The moment Guizhou arrived there, his eyes turned red. This was because he saw hundreds of creatures constantly wreaking havoc in this civilized country. At this moment, the entire civilized country was filled with cries and screams. There was killing and blood everywhere. At a glance, there was almost no place that was healthy or peaceful. As for those creatures, the strongest one was only comparable to the creature behind him that Luo Fan had enlightened with intelligence. As for the others were much weaker than them. In fact, it was precisely because these creatures were not too powerful that the civilized country could survive at this moment. That was why the civilized country was able to hold on at this moment and not be completely destroyed by the attacks of these creatures. That was why it was able to wait for the arrival of the turtle. This civilized country occupied an area with a radius of hundreds of millions of miles. However, compared to the civilized country that Guizhou was most familiar with, the civilization of this civilized country was obviously much worse. Whether it was the buildings, the clothes of the living beings, the culture created by the many living beings, or the strength of the living beings, they were all far inferior to the civilized country in the center. However, even if it could not be compared, it naturally revealed a sense of rugged beauty, which gave Guizhou an indescribable sense of intimacy. These are my people. In that instant, Yang Qi's eyes widened. Guizhou had this thought in his mind. Strictly speaking, The creatures in this civilized country were created by the world and had no direct connection with Guai Shou at all. But, the moment Guai Shou saw the creatures in this civilized country, he had an inexplicable feeling. All the living beings in the civilized country gave him a sense of familiarity. It was as if he had an extremely fundamental connection with them. That feeling was no different from the living beings he had created. It was also because of this connection that Guai Shou was so resentful at this moment. In this civilized country, the civilization developed by the many living beings was not too prosperous. At least, from the perspective of cultivation civilization, this was the case. At this moment, the strongest person in the entire civilized country was only at the sage-to-be level. He was not even a false saint, let alone a false saint or a desperate being, who was above the false saint. The reason why they could last until now was that they were united and used the continuous sacrifice of all the people in the country to resist. If that wasn't the case, with such power, let alone the hundreds of living beings attacking this country, even a single one of them would be enough to completely destroy this civilized country. The instant Guai Shou arrived, before the living beings in the entire civilized country could see him, they instantly felt an indescribable sense of safety and intimacy surging in their hearts. Some people with sharp senses could even find an inexplicable sense of childish admiration in their hearts. This was the feeling that these living beings had when they met their nominal creator. It was also the feeling brought about by the bond and connection between Guai Shou and them. At this moment, facing the tragic scene in front of him, Guai Shou did not hesitate at all. With a thought, he raised his hand and grabbed at the void. In an instant, an indescribable power descended from an inexplicable place. This power kept changing in the void and directly turned into a concept cage of nothingness that sucked in the civilized country. In an instant, the hundreds of living beings that were constantly wreaking havoc in the civilized country seemed to be grabbed by a huge invisible hand. As they screamed, they crossed the void and directly fell into the concept cage of nothingness. Under the concept of nothingness in the concept cage of nothingness, they were completely assimilated into the concept of nothingness. In the blink of an eye, they were all dead, their souls scattered, and they completely disappeared from this world. That extremely straightforward performance made people truly understand how powerful and terrifying the concept of nothingness was. Even Guai Shou could not help but feel inexplicably happy for his concept of nothingness at this moment. After all, ever since he had been able to convert power into concepts, all the opponents he had encountered were existences that could do the same. The power of such existences was needless to say. In front of them, the concept of nothingness that he had just grasped was at most on par with their concept. In battle, when he used his concept, it was almost always easily blocked by his opponent. Moreover, due to haste and other reasons, his opponents would even seize the opportunity to counterattack. Under such circumstances, although he clearly knew that the power of transforming power into concepts would become extremely terrifying, there was no evidence to prove this. Until now, he had casually used the concept cage of nothingness to easily deal with hundreds of living beings that he originally had to spend a lot of effort to deal with. Only then did he truly realize that after transforming power into concepts, its power would actually increase to this extent. Because of this discovery, the anger he felt when he saw the many living beings wreaking havoc in the civilized country and his people being slaughtered by hundreds of living beings suddenly diminished a lot. After transforming this power into a concept, although Guai Shou still had no way to transform this concept as he pleased like Luofan, he already had the ability to divide the power and condense this concept at will. Therefore, he already had the ability to divide the power at will, disperse this concept, and condense it at will. Therefore, at this moment, with a slight thought, he had directly erased the concept cage of nothingness, making it disappear without a trace. And this process, however, it did not cause his ability to guide the inexplicable power to cool down and be unable to be used. After doing all this, Gui Shou sighed. With a light step, he arrived above the civilized country. With a thought, his figure appeared in front of all the living beings in the entire civilized country. Although this civilized country was tens of thousands of times smaller than the civilized country that Luo Fan was in and had the protection of a false saint, it was still tens of thousands of times smaller. However, in terms of absolute size, this civilized country was still as wide as hundreds of millions of miles. With such a wide distance, if Gui Shou did not use this method, standing here, the only living beings that could see him were probably the living beings within a few miles of him. At this moment, all the living beings in this civilized country felt an indescribable feeling surge from their hearts. For a moment, almost all the living beings had tears streaming down their faces. They did not even need any prompts. They all knelt to Gui Shou and said while choking with sobs, "Greetings, Creator? Thank you, Creator, for saving us." When Gui Shou heard such a grand and sincere voice, he could not help but show a look of shame on his face. "Get up. I came too late, and that's why you guys suffered so much." His voice was not loud. However, it directly spread throughout the entire civilized country, allowing all the living beings in this civilized country to hear his voice in an instant. The moment they heard his voice, all the living beings cried nonstop. For a moment their hearts were filled with grievances, joy, happiness, excitement, and various other emotions almost at the same time. Under this kind of emotion they couldn't say anything, and could only kneel down and kowtow to the turtle. At this moment, Gui Shou had an inexplicable hidden worry in his heart. This place is so close, and it's already so tragic. Won't the other countries that are further away be even more tragic? Thinking of this, he suddenly felt that he could not continue to stay here. However, although he felt a sense of urgency to leave and go to other countries, he obviously could not leave as he wished. After all, this civilized country was still in chaos, and he still needed to deal with it. With a thought, he raised his hand and waved it gently. All the countless living beings felt an inexplicable vast power appear out of thin air, directly lifting all of them up. "In 3 days I will speak about the Tao. Those who are fated can come and listen." As he spoke, he waved his hand casually. Between the normal space-time of this civilized country and that inexplicable place, a layer of strange existence appeared out of thin air. And in this layer of strange existence, an island appeared out of thin air. It was an island that looked exactly the same as the island he created in the civilized country when he was preaching to the many living beings and the fake sage. Immediately afterward, he led the living beings behind him and directly stepped onto the island, directly appearing at the place where he was originally sitting, and closed his eyes to wait quietly. The sudden disappearance of the turtle lifespan caused all the beings in the kingdom to feel a sense of loss. However, very soon, they discovered that there was an inexplicable feeling in their hearts, as if there was some kind of inexplicable guidance pointing them to a certain location. Recalling what Gui Shou said before, they all understood that that location must be the so-called place where he would preach about the Tao. After Gui Shou sat on the island, with a thought, he sensed something. He immediately summoned 2 living beings that had been following him and said to them, "The 2 of you, go kill the living beings in that location, then come back and reply." As he spoke, he casually pointed at the void, and an image appeared, which marked a mountain range tens of millions of miles away from the civilized country. Those 2 living beings were intelligent living beings that Luo Fan had enlightened. Although they were much worse than living beings that were born with intelligence, compared to the living beings that were not born with intelligence in this world, they were much stronger. With their strength, it would be easy for one of them to deal with the living beings in the mountain range alone. Not to mention 2 of them. The 2 living beings hurriedly responded. In the beginning, they only followed Gui Shou because of Luo Fan's order, and they did not have a strong sense of identity with Gui Shou. But after this period of experience, after seeing how Gui Shou created a bloody path through the encirclement of many living beings, and how easily Guai Shou dealt with hundreds of living beings that were only slightly weaker than them, their sense of identity with him soared like a rocket. By now, they had almost regarded Guai Shou as an existence that was second only to Luo Fan. Naturally, they did not dare to neglect his orders. After they agreed, they quickly headed toward the mountain range. After sending them out, Guai Shou did not hesitate and casually pointed them out. One creature after another was summoned by him. Following that, he also gave instructions one by one, letting them head to various locations around the civilized country and kill the living beings there in various directions. Just like that. Not long after, only half of the living beings there were left. There were hundreds of places around the civilized country that originally had hidden dangers. Among them, there were living beings that could threaten the civilized country. He had already sent living beings to eliminate them. Guai Shou's current strength was already not much different from those living beings that were second only to the supreme leaders of the big organizations. Under such circumstances, although he had only raised his eyes to look inside and outside of the civilized country, he had already gained a deep understanding of the situation inside and outside of the civilized country. He had a clear understanding of the powerful beings hiding in the surroundings of the civilized country, as well as which beings had ill intentions towards the civilized country and which ones had no ill intentions towards it. Those living beings that he was currently targeting were living beings that had malicious intentions towards the civilized country. As most of the living beings left, gradually, more and more living beings began to appear on this island. The way they appeared was the same as in another civilized country. Those beings who had gone to listen to the Longevity Turtle's Tao lecture had all appeared in the same way. They had also walked and appeared here. After these living beings appeared, they could not see Guai Shou either. They were also attracted by the patterns on the square and wholeheartedly immersed themselves in it. They began to diligently study and comprehend the mysteries within. Compared to another civilized country that had a complete and prosperous cultivation civilization, the living beings in this civilized country behaved completely differently. Because they did not have a complete and prosperous cultivation civilization, their knowledge of cultivation was quite poor. Therefore, they were more immersed in comprehending these patterns than the living beings in another civilized country, and they gained more. Even before Guai Shou began to lecture about the Great Tao, some living beings had already comprehended some key points of cultivation from the square and directly began to break through their realms. The number of such living beings continued to increase as the number of living beings increased. 3 days later, when there were already hundreds of millions of living beings in the square, the number of such living beings had already reached over 1 million. This number was simply unbelievable. Guai Shou looked at the scene in front of him and sighed. He directly appeared in front of the many living beings. Immediately after, without any nonsense or small talk, he began to talk about the principles of cultivation from guiding qi into his body. This time, due to the urgency of time, he did not intend to lecture for too long. Therefore, during the lecture, he used a method to greatly increase the acceptance of the many living beings of the content he was talking about. However, even so, he still talked for a total of 99 days before he finally talked about the method to become a false saint. As for what happened after that, he did not say anything about how to cultivate and improve after becoming a false saint. It was not that he cherished his knowledge. It was because he clearly knew that there was no point in talking about those things anymore. Putting everything else aside, just the cultivation method after the false saint that he talked about later on and the method to become a false saint was obviously something that not many living beings could understand. Almost every living being could only memorize the contents of Guai Shou's lecture with great difficulty. Under such circumstances, was there any need for him to talk about the cultivation method after becoming a true saint? When Guai Shou stopped lecturing, the many living beings no longer felt as if they were unsatisfied. On the contrary, every living being heaved a long sigh of relief. The words, "It's finally over," were almost directly written on their faces. Anyone could tell what they were thinking at a glance. These living beings could not be blamed for this. Although they were extremely clear that listening to Guei Shou's lecture would be a great opportunity for them, it was enough to establish their future cultivation foundation. Listening to any more words might reduce many obstacles they would encounter in their future cultivation process. However, knowing was one thing. The strongest among them was only at the quasi-saint level. They could still roughly listen to the cultivation of the false saint level. After careful thinking and careful research, they could still understand. However, as for how to prove one's Tao and become a false saint, how to increase one's chances of becoming a false saint, the taboo of becoming a false saint, and so on, those were simply heavenly books. Just the memory alone was already a burden for them. In that case, how could they not heave a sigh of relief when Guei Shou finally stopped lecturing? Although, after heaving a sigh of relief, they all felt extremely ashamed in the process of these 99 days of lecturing. The living beings that Guei Shou sent out had already returned one after another. The many areas outside this civilized country that were dangerous to this civilized country had also been completely wiped out during this process. In other words, for the time being, this civilized country, all the hidden dangers that could lead to its eventual destruction had been eliminated. After discovering this, Guei Shou was finally relieved. After that, he directly pointed out the two living beings that he had sent out at the beginning and said to them, "From today onwards, the two of you will stay here and protect this country. I will let the living beings of this country worship you. All you have to do is help this country survive when it encounters danger that they can't resist." The two living beings were obviously a little unwilling. Although they wanted to make contributions for the new protagonist of this world, it did not mean that they were willing to be tied to this civilized country. After all, the pursuit of freedom was the nature of all living beings. You don't have to be unwilling. You must know that this country is the new protagonist of this world. With their worship, you will also have the status of a protagonist of this world. When that time comes, there will naturally be endless benefits. You will know this in the future. When that time comes, you might even have to thank me for letting you stay here, Guei Shou said calmly when he saw that they were unwilling. Although these living beings had to obey his forceful orders, they were protecting this country after all. Of course, the more active they were, the better. It's not that we don't want to, but we are so weak. What if we encounter enemies that we can't resist? One of the living beings said hesitantly. When that time comes, you just need to inform me, and then you can leave on your own, Guei Shou said. Hearing this, the two living beings nodded. Seeing that they nodded, Guei Shou waved his hand and made them appear. They directly appeared in front of the hundreds of millions of living beings in this civilized country. Among these two living beings, one looked like a ferocious white tiger. Its entire body gave off an extremely vigorous and powerful aura. It stood there like a powerful divine beast that could overturn the universe. The other looked like an extremely gorgeous bird. This bird's entire body was surrounded by a faint frost aura, but it felt so cold, so noble, and so sacred. It was also like a powerful divine beast. Compared to the many living beings that had attacked this civilized country before, the light of wisdom in their eyes completely distinguished the two. No one would confuse them with those living beings. Chapter 1598. The Guei Shou said to the many creatures, "These two are my friends and can be the guardian divine beasts of the nation. As long as you don't forget to worship them, they will always protect this nation." Hearing this, the many creatures were in an uproar. Whether it was a divine beast or not, the Guei Shou's words clearly meant that it was going to leave soon. For the many cultivators in this civilized nation who originally thought that the Guei Shou's would stay here to protect them, the feeling was self-evident. To them, this moment was like a calamity falling from the sky. At this moment, the two creatures pointed out by the Guei Shou released their auras. In an instant, An extremely powerful aura that could even distort the void directly descended on this island. Along with this momentum, the entire island began to emit cracking sound. It felt as if something inside the island was shattering. At the same time, the entire island began to tremble slightly. This extremely shocking scene caused all the cultivators listening to the Tao to involuntarily stop chattering. They all looked at the two beings in the sky with a mixture of shock and fear. Although the two creatures did not give them a good look, they all felt an inexplicable sense of security at this moment. Although the two creatures were clearly weaker than the Guizhou, they were many times stronger than them. With their protection, the safety of this civilized nation would not be much weaker than the Guizhou's. Compared to the situation where they had no one to rely on, the situation was many times better. Seeing the changes in the expressions of the many creatures, the two creatures withdrew their auras. The Guizhou quietly appeared in the void again. Its eyes filled with wisdom seemed to be staring at every cultivator. Seeing that the two creatures had settled the matter, the Guizhou nodded and said, "That's it. You all have to cultivate well from now on. In the future, if you meet creatures that have the same appearance as you, that is your own race. That is your own race. You must unite them closely. Go." With that said, with a wave of his hand, all the cultivators on the island who were listening to him were instantly sent away from the island. They appeared at the place where they were before they entered the island. After they left, the Guizhou said to the two creatures that he had arranged to stay. He said, "Protecting this country is related to your future. You must not neglect it." The two living beings naturally understood the importance of this. In fact, when the many living beings acknowledged them as the guardian divine beasts of this civilized country, they already had an inexplicable feeling. It was as if their connection with the world had become closer than before. How could he dare to ignore Guizhou's words? He quickly said, "We understand." Guizhou nodded and said to the other living beings, "We still have many other places to go. We can't delay any longer. Let's go." As he spoke, he soared into the sky. He turned into a streak of light and left the island, heading in the direction of the other civilized country that he sensed was located. The other living beings bade farewell to the ones who stayed, then they also turned into escape lights and flew away in the direction of Guizhou. In the following long period of time, the Guizhou and these creatures were like this time. He traveled from one country to another. Of course, not all of these countries were the same as the first one they encountered. They happened to be in an abyss of suffering and could be destroyed at any time. Most of them were still in a state of impending danger. However, no matter if they were being attacked or were about to be attacked, the Guizhou just pushed them away. After coming here, he directly blended his aura with the living beings in this country. Then, he directly sent many living beings to various places around the country to eliminate the living beings that might pose a threat to this country. After temporarily eliminating the future troubles of this country, he directly preached in those countries, imparted the perfect cultivation system, and tried his best to guide the cultivators in those civilized countries to improve their cultivation realm. After that, just like the first country, he left behind two cultivators that he brought to serve as the guardian divine beasts of that civilized country. Then, he left that civilized country for another purpose. In this way, in just a short 1,000 years, there were no more living beings around the Guizhou. All the living beings had been left in those civilized countries by him to serve as the guardian divine beasts of those countries. And even so, the area that he had traveled had not even stepped out of the area controlled by the big organizations. In other words, he had not left a very small corner of this world. In other words, there were even more civilized countries waiting for him outside the countries that he had traveled to. This won't do. If I don't leave any living beings to guard the country, there will still be living beings after I leave, even if I eliminate all the dangers around the country. At that time, the country will still be in great danger. On this day, when the Guizhou finished preaching, Such a thought suddenly flashed through his mind. Before coming to this civilized country, he had already left all the living beings that had been enlightened with intelligence in the various countries. According to his original plan, he should have left directly after he finished preaching and no longer cared about this civilized country in front of him. However, when things came to a head, when he was really about to leave, he suddenly felt that it was inappropriate to do so. Although this civilized country already had great potential after he preached here for nearly 100 days, and there was a high possibility that a false saint would appear. However, that would take time after all. There would definitely be a rather long period of time before the false saint guarding this country appeared. During this period of time, the entire civilized country was as fragile as tofu. If something were to go wrong and some beings that were slightly more powerful than the ordinary beings in the world came here, the entire civilized nation would be completely destroyed in a single night. All living beings would die. At that time, no matter how great their potential was, what was the point? The Guei Shou thought about it, but in the end, he could not leave this civilized country here and let it fend for itself. Perhaps I should also enlighten some living beings to serve as the guardian divine beasts of the country. With this thought in mind, his heart stirred. His figure had already disappeared from the island. During the entire process, not a single cultivator noticed his departure. In the eyes of the many cultivators, the Guei Shou was still sitting there cross-legged, still spitting out Tao sounds one after another, shaking their minds. It shook the essence of their lives, allowing them to constantly comprehend some inexplicable and mysterious cultivation principles. After the Guei Shou left the island, he carefully sensed and confirmed his target. With a thought, he came to a vast lake that was hundreds of billions of light-years away from the civilized country. The lake was so vast that it was probably more than enough to place the entire civilized country that he had just left. The lake water in the lake was also not ordinary lake water, but a product condensed and transformed by a kind of true saint mystery in an inexplicable way. It was extremely beneficial to the cultivation of any living being. Obviously, to be able to occupy such a lake, the living beings in the lake must be extremely powerful. The creature in the lake must be extremely powerful. Otherwise, it would be impossible for it to escape the covetous eyes of the other creatures. They would guarantee that this lake belonged to them. When the Guei Shou arrived, he did not stand on ceremony at all. He released his aura and directly pressed down on the lake. At this moment, a series of earth-shattering roars rang out from the lake. There were all kinds of voices, and although their strengths were different, however, all of them were shocking. Immediately after, figures rushed out of the lake one after another. They floated in midair and roared at the Guei Shou. Looking at the thousands of densely packed creatures, the Guei Shou showed a satisfied expression. The reason why he chose this lake was not only that the creatures in the lake were extremely powerful, but more importantly, although the creatures in the lake were more powerful than ordinary creatures with innate wisdom, they did not have innate wisdom. In other words, among the thousands of creatures in the lake, none of them had the ability to think completely. In comparison, this was much more important than their strength. After all, if the Guei Shou had the ability to think completely, he could not guarantee that these creatures would regard him as the supreme being if he enlightened them. This was obviously a devastating blow to the Guei Shou's plan of placing these creatures in the civilized countries to help them resist dangers and protect them. In fact, if it were not for this harsh requirement, why would the Guei Shou come to this place that was hundreds of billions of light-years away? Within this area of hundreds of billions of miles, there were tens of thousands of places where living beings gathered like this one for him to choose from. Which of them was not closer than this one? After discovering that these creatures were indeed as he had imagined, the Guei Shou no longer hesitated. With a thought, he opened his mouth and spat out Tao sounds one by one. These Tao sounds seeped into the void and passed through the void to the hearts of each creature, constantly shaking them. Gradually, These creatures' minds and life essences began to gradually merge with the Tao sounds he spat out. At this moment, faint thunderclaps came from the void. These thunderclaps were extremely oppressive and shocking. After they spread down, every creature above the lake could not help but tremble slightly. At this moment, the Gui Shou had an inexplicable feeling. It was as if he had suddenly been rejected by the entire world, as if the entire world was gathering a powerful attack to erase him. As expected, it's not a simple matter to enlighten a creature without intelligence. Such a thought flashed through Gui Shou's mind at this moment. With this thought, he began to admire Luo Fan even more for being able to easily enlighten so many creatures. After all, back then, Luo Fan inadvertently enlightened so many creatures. Moreover, the entire process was extremely easy, and he did not encounter any difficulties at all. Now, the Gui Shou wanted to enlighten these creatures. Before he could make any decisive progress, such a change had already occurred in this world. It was already threatening him, wanting him to stop. However, the Gui Shou was many times stronger than before. This kind of threat that could make him tremble and not even dare to move in the slightest in the past, he only paid a little attention to it. He directly tossed it aside and continued with his previous plan. The Tao sounds from his mouth. In fact, compared to before, they became even more concentrated. These Tao voices were so mysterious and unbelievable. After they entered the bodies of the thousands of living beings, they resonated strongly with the essence of their lives. As they resonated, these creatures gradually emitted all kinds of inexplicable fluctuations. These fluctuations were based on the creature's own strength, but the power they emitted was not something the creature's own strength could compare with. Under these fluctuations, the space around the creatures seemed to be separated from the outside world, as if it was about to become an independent entity. An aura that did not belong to this world was gradually emitted from it. Following the appearance of this change, the thunderous roar that came from the void became even louder and more shocking. Vaguely, there were pitch-black clouds gradually gathering in the void. Between those clouds, one could even see wisps of lightning flashing within them. Suddenly, at a certain moment, the pitch-black clouds above the void shook slightly. A bolt of lightning fell from the sky, directly landing on the Gui Shou's head. In an instant, the Gui Shou felt as if his body was being crushed by the whole world. He felt as if his whole body was about to collapse and explode into countless pieces. So strong! How could the Gui Shou dare to be careless at this time? In an instant, he quickly released the power condensed in his body, directly forming a concept cage of nothingness, directly wrapping himself within. With the appearance of the concept cage of nothingness, the lightning that struck down from above the void was directly disintegrated by the concept cage of nothingness, turning into a concept of nothingness out of thin air. It would no longer cause any damage to him. The moment this change was completed, the Gui Shou felt his body lighten, and even the powerful pressure from above the void had disappeared without a trace. Even so, it was clearly not the time for him to completely relax. The world seemed to be provoked, and it began to strike down again and again, hitting the concept cage of nothingness around his body, causing waves of ripples in the concept cage of nothingness. It looked as if one stone after another was thrown into the concept cage of nothingness. During this entire process, the Tao voice from the Gui Shou's mouth did not stop at all. It was still as stable as before, and it was still effective on the many living beings. At this moment, although the many living beings were not restrained, they had stopped struggling and looking at the Gui Shou with hatred. In each of their eyes, there was an existence that they had never had before, and it was slowly being derived bit by bit. That was wisdom. It was also the emergence of this wisdom that made these living beings instinctively feel close to the Gui Shou, even though they had not yet reached the stage where they could clearly understand how much price the Gui Shou had paid to achieve all of this. As time passed, the lightning that struck down from above the void became more and more concentrated, and the power also became greater and greater. But no matter how much the power increased, the Gui Shou was able to withstand it rather easily. In other words, the concept cage of nothingness around the Gui Shou's body easily withstood it, and it did not even cause much shock to its body. In fact, at this moment, the Gui Shou was already completely at ease. This was because he could clearly feel that although the lightning was constantly striking down from above, no matter how much the power of the lightning increased, no matter how concentrated they became, it was still far from the tribulation of form transformation that he had encountered back then. It could be said that, even if the power of the tens of thousands of lightning bolts that he had endured from the beginning were all added up, it could not compare to any of the lightning bolts that he had encountered back then. With such power, even if he was still at the level when he had just undergone form transformation, he would not be in any danger. Not to mention, the current him was at least tens of thousands of times stronger than before. Under such circumstances, why would he need to worry about the lightning that descended from the void? The Gui Shou let out the Tao voice for 3 days and 3 nights, and the lightning that struck down from above also lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. In the end, the lightning that struck down from above the void was so dense that it was completely connected. It no longer looked like bolts of lightning descending from the sky. Instead, there was a lightning pillar piercing down from the clouds above, directly connecting to the concept cage of nothingness around his body. And at this moment, in front of him, the wisdom in the eyes of the many creatures above the lake had unknowingly risen to an extremely impressive level. Even now, Gui Shou, on the other hand, was already able to observe many complicated emotions and thoughts from the intelligence. After carefully distinguishing them and discovering that almost every creature had complete wisdom, the Gui Shou nodded and closed his mouth to stop the Tao voice that had been constantly spewing out. As the Tao voice stopped, the lightning pillar that pierced down from the clouds above the void instantly disappeared, and the clouds above the void also collapsed in an instant. They directly turned invisible. It was also at this moment that the fluctuation that was generated by the Tao voice around the bodies of the many creatures that had completely isolated them from the outside world also completely dissipated. It caused those creatures to instantly return to their normal appearances. In comparison, only the wisdom in their eyes could distinguish them from the past. The many creatures seemed to have woken up from a dream at this moment, and they all knelt to the Gui Shou in midair, thanking their master for enlightening them. As for why they called the Gui Shou their master, it was because their wisdom was formed by the Gui Shou, so they naturally had inexplicable feelings for the Gui Shou. The Gui Shou looked at them. However, he was secretly delighted. He knew clearly that from now on, he no longer needed to worry about the guardian divine beasts of the civilized countries that he was about to walk on. He smiled and said, "No need to be so polite, come with me." As he spoke, he turned into a ray of light and flew into the distance. Even if those living beings were ordinary living beings in this world, their strength had already reached the false sage level. It could even be said that compared to those creatures that were born with wisdom, their wisdom was inferior and they could not guide the inexplicable power to descend. Under such circumstances, the birth of wisdom had already made up for one of the 2 shortcomings, and they were completely qualified to serve as the guardian divine beasts of the various civilized countries. Those creatures were so powerful, so it was naturally not a problem for them to catch up to the Gui Shou. Very soon, they arrived at the civilized country that he had been preaching at with the Gui Shou at an extremely fast speed in their own ways. They also followed the Gui Shou into the island. From his departure until his return, the many cultivators on the island did not change at all. To them, Gui Shou had always been there, always preaching to them, always imparting all sorts of incredible cultivation principles to them. The Gui Shou had been preaching here for more than 100 days, but he should have left a few days ago. However, because of these living creatures that he had just enlightened, the Gui Shou could only continue to stay here and start from the beginning. Right now, he was not preaching to the cultivators in this civilized country, but to the living creatures that he had enlightened and prepared to be placed in this civilized country as guardian divine beasts. Although the strength of these living creatures was already quite impressive, the methods they used were too crude, and their potential was still at an extremely low level. Gui Shou was not at ease to use them to protect this civilized country. Of course, after all, the foundation of these living creatures was worlds apart from the foundation of the cultivators in the civilized country. Therefore, the Gui Shou did not give a detailed lecture like the first time. Instead, he only talked about the key cultivation principles. As for some of the minor details that these living creatures had already mastered, he only briefly mentioned them.